Welcome. I'm Nicola Jennings, Director of the Athena Art Foundation, and I'm here because I'm one of the editors of the Colnaghi Studies Journal, along with Irene Brooke and Jeremy Howard. Irene, I will introduce later. Jeremy sadly couldn't be with us today. As some of you know, the papers in this symposium are intended for publication next spring in the journal, which we've been editing since it started in 2017. This is the third annual symposium that we've hosted here with the Colnaghi Foundation. The first was on art dealing in the Gilded Age, which is one of Jeremy's special subjects. And the second was on the art of Viceregal Latin America. And you can read some of the proceedings in Colnaghi Studies Journal 16. Colnaghi have been an amazing support for our scholarly efforts in this period, and I want to give particularly thanks to Candida Lodovico De Angelis Corvi, Director of the Colnaghi Foundation and Global Director of Colnaghi, and to Jorge Cole, Executive Director and owner of Colnaghi, and the person we have to thank for encouraging us to set up Colnaghi Studies Journal all those years ago. I'd also like to thank the Colnaghi team, in particular Maddie Galbraith, Head of Operations, who's been incredibly generous with her time in helping us to organize this. Tristan Petzela, Gallery Assistant, who also provided much needed assistance last year. And Marie Grindel, the Gallery's new Content and PR Specialist. At Athena, I'd like to thank Sarah Cousins, our Foundation Manager, and Abigail Spencer, Digital Media Manager, for their help. Last but not least are the two people who've really been the driving force behind today's symposium. Bianca Arthur Hull, Harold Wright Fellow in the Prints and Drawings Department in the British Museum, and recent Courtauld graduate, who's tirelessly worked over the past months to help us shape the proposal for the symposium, to spread the word amongst scholars and to gather in the papers that you will hear today. And Irene Brooke, Editor-in-Chief of Colnaghi Studies Journal, who's worked closely with Bianca to make it all happen. Irene has for many years taught on Renaissance Venice at the Courtauld, where she also did her PhD. Her research focuses primarily on the intersections between artistic and intellectual culture in early 16th century Venice, with articles on Cardinal Pietro Bembo's patronage and collecting strategies, and on the engraver Giulio Campagnola. She has recently co-edited a volume on the portrait cultures of early modern cardinals, and she's currently co-editing another looking at the afterlives of the classical tradition in a variety of cultures. Finally, thanks also to Professor Suzanne Babai, who is a trustee of Athena and was instrumental in helping us to shape the idea for this symposium. So my first task today is to introduce our first speaker. Eunice Yu is a DPhil candidate in the history of art at the University of Oxford. She holds an MA in the history of art from the Courtauld Institute and a BA in the history and history of art from Cornell University. Her dissertation, Recrafting Mediality, the Networks of the Bertelli Publishing Dynasty, unites art, book, and social history to explore the dynamic interplay between mid-range printers and the burgeoning book and figural print publishing industries in early modern Venice. Her research reveals how these printers democratize access to written and visual cultures, reaching audiences across diverse socioeconomic and geographic spectrums.
Hi, everyone. I'm incredibly excited to be here with you all today. I just want to thank Nicola so much for the lovely introduction, and of course, Irene and Bianca and all of the other organizers of the Impressions of Empire seminar for inviting me to speak here with you guys today. So without further ado, let's get started. A place of paradise, a place of persecution. The identity of Venice has long been held within the eye of the beholder. By the end of the 15th century, the lagoon city stood at the center of an expanding and shifting world. As a capital of a large multilingual and multi-faith empire, a trading crossroads, and a thriving center of print production, Venice represented a microcosm of early modern global exploration, transformation, commerce, and diplomacy. Thus, how did the waning political and economic might of the Venetian Empire in the late 16th century affect how its citizens secured a sense of civic identity? My paper, Collecting and Constructing National Identity in Print, Translations of Empire from the Black Sea to the Adriatic, aims to complicate our understanding of the hybridity of media and the dynamic exchange of the history of publishing by investigating how consumers adopted nationalistic methodologies used in ethnographic texts to popularize the production of cartographic, sartorial, and civic images of Venice. I present a case study of an eclectic yet deliberately structured sampleband of city views, costume books, and ethnographic prints from the Bertelli publishing family. By drawing upon the rich variety of the album's contents, I argue that the print album is a compilation of social and geographic observation that uses cartography and costume to construct a sense of the Venetian identity through its exchanges with outsiders. I propose Sigismund von Herberstein's 1549 ethnographical account of Muscovy, Notes on Muscovite Affairs, as a vital source for the album's structure and subject matter. I address how these domestic pictorial constructions of Venetian identity are representative of the paradoxical identity of Venice itself, where notions of the sacred and the profane coexisted in peaceful harmony. As a destination for multitudes of diverse and itinerant people, the lagoon city solidified into a cosmopolitan junction in the early modern era. Consequently, constructing and securing a unique sense of Venezianita, or Venetianness, became an important task for many of its citizens. The burgeoning interest in the civic imagery of Venice is perhaps best exemplified by the print volume we will discuss today, which is currently held in the New York Public Library. Found in the late 16th century, the sampleband is frequently incorrectly cited as Donato Bertelli's 1578 edition of the True Images and Descriptions of the Most Noble Cities of the World, a published collection of maps from across the globe. However, when we examine the contents of the volume, which I've listed on the slide you see here, it's evident that rather than a single publication, the album is a careful compilation of printed works by several artists, structured to cater towards the collector's individual and worldly interests. The lack of recorded existences of published sets of engravings depicting both maps and costumes of different nations demonstrates the unique nature of this compilation. And although the provenance of the sampleband remains unknown, watermark and binding structure analysis indicates that it was printed and bound in Venice. Additionally, the album's primary focus on Venice, depicted through 12 images, the most of any city within the work, further suggests the compiler's Venetian identity. Perhaps the most unusual addition in the album is a woodcut map of Moscow, removed from the 1557 German edition of Sigismund von Herberstein's Notes on Muscovite Affairs. This ethnographical account of Muscovy, the 16th century Russian state, was likely a vital source for the album's structure and subject matter, and I argue that the book's structure inspired our compiler to characterize Venice as a cultural center of an expanding world within his album. Inserted after Donato Bertelli's illustrated cartographic book, this map of Moscow, when viewed in conjunction with the rest of the volume, is a clear stylistic and linguistic outlier. However, its inclusion, despite its incongruity, indicates that the edition was a conscious and deliberate choice made by the compiler. The woodcut map depicting the walled city of Moscow and its tens of thousands of wooden houses is the only work in the album that includes German printed text in fractal black letter typeface. The map is larger than the Bertelli's engraved maps printed in Italian Roman typeface. Now, why would our collector choose to remove this large-scale German map of Moscow from its original binding and place it into his primarily Venetian-focused album as a fold-out map? Well, it is evident that the compiler was aware of the numerous editions of Notes on Muscovite Affairs, indicating his identity as an avid reader of Herberstein and a collector of cultured interests. The German edition of the book from which this map was removed was likely available in Venice for consumption, as German merchants were responsible for nearly half of the city's book production during the Cinquecento. In Venice, Italian editions of Herberstein's work were printed in 1550, a year after the book's original publication, and again in 1583, around the time our compiler created his print album. So it's likely that our compiler knew of both Venetian publications, as he displayed his maps of the city of Moscow in a manner that mirrors the display of the map of the region of Muscovy in the 1550 Italian version of the book, which was the only known edition of Herberstein's work to contain a fold-out map. Rather than a simple matter of practicality, it is possible that the compiler displayed his map of Moscow in this manner to pay homage to the Italian edition of the book that served as the inspiration for his samoband. The compiler's decision to include a German map of Moscow rather than the Italian map of Muscovy was most likely due to his desire to adhere to the theme of geographic city views set by Donato Bertelli's Book of Maps. The compiler then supplements his map of Moscow with 3 etchings of Muscovian citizens to create a broad representation of Muscovite identity. The concentrated effort that our compiler exerts into representing Moscow indicates the influence that Herberstein's work must have had on the conception and arrangement of his print album. In the late 15th century, Muscovy, the fledgling Russian state, sprung to prominence among neighboring Western states due to the imperialist policies of Ivan III. Therefore, in 1549, when aristocrat Sigismund von Herberstein published his account of his 2 diplomatic missions to Moscow on behalf of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II, it quickly grew to become the most important historical and ethnographical work on Russia. More than 12 editions were printed in the 16th century alone. Separated into 3 sections, the book presents a broad view of Muscovian trade, life, and customs. Herberstein begins with a detailed description of the geography of Russian territory from the Carpathian Mountains to the Black Sea, but he first begins with a description of the capital of Moscow. The following chapters address a wide range of topics, including the history, natural history, politics, religion, and social customs of the state. Within this section, Herberstein describes the military, art, architecture, and clothing of Moscow and other Muscovite settlements. Herberstein's final chapter comprises a detailed account of his own diplomatic missions and welcome at the court of Moscow. Our compiler purposefully orders his samoband in a manner that's redolent of the organizational structure of Herberstein's text, which establishes Muscovite identity within the context of a growing Russian state. Muscovy was greatly expanded by rulers Ivan III and Vasily III, who brought the independent duchies of different Rurikid princes under their direct control. As Herberstein conveys notions of Muscovite identity through descriptions of its geography, social customs, and dress, our compiler similarly explores geographically and sartorially Venice's shifting identity within the context of an expanding world by including in his album books of maps and costumes that depict Venice alongside cities from other nations. Excogitating Venice's role within the growing globe, the compiler begins his print album with Donato Bertelli's true images and descriptions of the most noble cities of the world. The album includes 23 views of cities from across Europe, Africa, and the Near East, of which this bird's eye view of Venice is first. This view of Venice is then followed by maps of other Italian city-states, including Florence, Milan, Siena, Parma, Messina, and Rome. These views are then preceded by maps of other prominent European cities, such as Paris, Geneva, and Antwerp, which themselves are followed by depictions of cities of distant lands, such as Cairo, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. The ordering of these maps projects the primacy of the Venetian state, as it is depicted as the city first among Italy, then among Europe, and then among the greater world. The idea that Venice was a certain center of the world was widely held among Venetians and even touted by foreigners until the end of the 17th century. As Bronwyn Wilson notes, Francesco Sansovino exclaimed that the city can be called the theater of the world in the eye of Italy. English ecclesiastic Peter Heylin wrote in his book, "Europe is the head of the world, Italy the face of Europe, and Venice the eye of Italy. It is the fairest, strongest, and most active part of that powerful body." This organizational structure projecting the primacy of the Venetian state within the world also echoes Herberstein's description of Moscow as the center of Muscovy, which was the central principality of the increasing Russian Empire, which included territories such as Ryazan and Novgorod. Many of the maps included in Donato Bertelli's cartographic book contain engraved legends listing prominent landmarks in the city. The first two sites listed, St. Mark's Square and the Ducal Palace, immediately bring the viewer's attention to the city's civic, religious, and political center. These two landmarks were vital for the myth-making of Venice, as they projected an image of an ideal republic presented in a set of harmonious juxtapositions. St. Mark's Square represents Venice as a pious and faithful follower of the Roman Catholic Church, born to flourish under the divine providence of the city's patron saint. Opposingly, the Ducal Palace projects notions of the city as a lasting beacon from the governments of antiquity and a republic of primeval consensus and harmony. As Venice lost economic and political power during the 16th century due to the discovery of the New World, expanded maritime trade routes by other European powers, and constant warfare, Venetians turned to the one thing that set their city apart from the rest of Italy, its long-standing republican government. This, as many citizens eagerly pointed out, made the city the only legitimate successor to the great republics of classical antiquity. Therefore, Venice surpassed Rome. By listing St. Mark's Square and the Ducal Palace as the first two locations on the map of Venice, notions of the sacred and the profane were conveyed to coexist both ideologically and physically within the same space, resulting in a potent display of civic harmony that was integral to the Venetian sense of identity and served as a bulwark for the Serenissima until its fall to Napoleon in the 18th century. The influence of the use of woodcut illustrations in the notes on Muscovite affairs is also evident in the album's organization. The German edition of Herberstein's work, from which the compiler's map of Moscow was removed, was the first work in the European world to depict images of dress of two different nations, that of Muscovy and the Holy Roman Empire. These illustrations allow Germanic readers to compare their own identity with that of Russians. Herberstein's book was therefore a pioneering work in this description and choreographic representation of clothing, as it predates the popularity of costume books in the 1570s and 80s. The woodcuts in Herberstein's German text primarily illustrate the costume and arms of the soldiers of Muscovy and the Holy Roman Empire. For readers, these images solidify a sense of Germanic identity through its collocation with Slavic identity. The woodcut on the left depicts three Russian archers on horseback. They are shown dressed in cone hats and quilted caftans known as tile. The soldiers carry their chief weapon, the longbow, in addition to weapons used in close combat, such as the saber and the mace. The Russian soldiers are contrasted by illustrations of the imperial army of the Holy Roman Empire. The right image depicts Herberstein as a standard bearer for Maximilian I. These soldiers, apart from Herberstein, are clean-shaven, differentiating them from Russian soldiers who sport long pointed beards. In stark contrast to the simple quilted caftans of the Muscovite archers, members of the imperial army are heavily armored and intricately decorated plate mail with plumed helmets and berets. Instead of longbows and arrows, they wield longswords and spears. The military might of the Holy Roman Empire is further displayed through the depiction of cannons. Within the text, Herberstein draws contrast between the two armies, writing, "The prince has now German and Italian cannon founders, such as our own princes use, and yet these people cannot understand the use of them, nor can they ever employ them in an engagement. They seem not to comprehend the different kinds of artillery." Herberstein thus presents the German army as militarily and technologically advanced compared to that of the Muscovites. His notion of the superiority of the German militia is then cemented by depictions of the armies in woodcut illustrations. Thus, the pictorial representation of costume, in conjunction with written description, becomes a principal frame in which a sense of national identity is formed. As the borders of nations fluctuated, the boundaries of national identity could be easily translated through dress and transmitted through illustration. Herberstein thus fosters a sense of nationalism, propagated not only through the creation of identity in opposition to that of a foreigner, but also projected through images of dress in which a particular local types are selected and then critiqued as being representative of a whole. This strategy of solidifying Germanic identity through juxtaposition with Russian identity served as a vital source of inspiration for our compiler, who within his sammelband presents Venetian identity by contextualizing images of its geography and citizens with those of different nations. continuing his imitation of the organizational structure of Herberstein's text, which moves from descriptions of geography to social customs and then to geographic exploration. Our compiler sartorially asserts Venetian identity by including a copy after Ferrando Baratelli's costume book, Clothing of All Nations of Our Age. The compiler presents Venetian identity by contextualizing images of its citizens with those of different principalities. The costume book moves from an Italian to worldly context, with each folio consisting of a single engraved figure enclosed in a simple landscape and identified by a label. Costume books fueled interest in civic or regional identities by making comparisons between them easy. The standard format of Bertelli's work allowed for costumes to become primary indicators of similarity or difference. Venetian viewers were thus able to compare their dress to those of other locales, including those found beyond Europe. The similarities in forms of dress helped foster a sense of collective identity within nations and highlighted bonds between neighbors. For example, Venetian viewers of this work would have more easily identified with Roman or Florentine attire than garments worn by those from distant lands such as Ethiopia. Thus, the fantastic headwear and hemlines imagined for places such as Turkey and Ethiopia became visible components of otherness. Additionally, the ability to recognize these similarities and differences in visual representations of sartorial practice came with assumptions of larger differences in social and cultural practices. By ordering the costume book to begin with the dress of Venetians, the city is established as an explicit locus through which all other nations are seen. This is reminiscent of Donato Bertelli's Book of Maps, which represents Venice as the eye of Italy and center of the world. Similarly, the costumes allow the reader to grasp a manufactured sense of the world through its relation to Venice. Thus, it is in Venice that our viewer begins his imaginary voyage across the globe to distant peripheries. The othering of peoples through dress served to cement Venetian identity, assuaging personal anxieties during a time when the boundaries of Europe were shifting and the size of the known world was greatly expanding. By the end of the 16th century, it's important to remember that the size of the known world in Western Europe had nearly doubled. In Venice, a city filled with foreigners, the fear that excessive contact with outsiders could corrupt the citizen of his Venezianita was incredibly common. This looming apprehension was voiced by historian Francesco Sansovino, who, despite lauding the glories of the multicultural and multi-ethnic state, worried about the effects that the introduction of exotic traditions and modes of dress would have on the city. He wrote, "So starting with dress, which is indicative of a person's spirit, we see that a large number of Italians, forgetting that they are natives of Italy, have taken to following fashions from abroad. Together with their ideas, they have also changed their clothes, wanting to appear now French, now Spanish, and this is certainly to their great harm and shame. Only this city, in general, has preserved itself less corrupt than others, even if in all ages it has been and continues to be a refuge for outsiders, who tend to bring with them customs and practices of their own. Thus, in a state known for its tolerant and multicultural nature, the costume book separated Venetian identity and heritage. Within his print album, the work not only became a vessel for armchair tourism where a viewer could mentally travel the world, but it became a guidebook for Venetians to foreigners within their own city. The compiler's focus on Venice is cemented by his inclusion of Pietro Bertelli's Courtesan series, which contains 9 narrative engravings of Venice, 7 of which flaunt flaps. This volume contains the only known full set of Pietro's series. It is important to highlight that the 7 images of courtesans are bookended by stately images of the city. When the engravings are viewed in conjunction, they present an image of Venice as a place of paradoxical juxtapositions, where the city's identities as both the pleasure garden and civic center of Europe coexist in harmony. The engravings within Pietro Bertelli's series therefore draw upon positive themes of civic pride and identity and address within them Venice's social and geographic origins and accomplishments. As the first work in the series, this depiction of the tomb of Antenor reveals the sarcophagus of the Trojan hero and founder of Padua. Though Venetians traditionally claim to have their city founded by refugees in 421, by the late 13th century, they also routinely claimed that Antenor had found their city before reaching Padua. The double-page format of the tomb underscores its importance. Despite the later destruction of the Church of San Lorenzo behind, Bertelli's engraving accurately records the monument, displaying its epitaph and the artisan at work below to enhance its sense of documentary realism. Bertelli's meticulous rendering reflects the monument's continued political and cultural significance. By appropriating Padua's ancient founder, Venetians asserted a lineage reaching back to Troy, implying that their republic's origins were as ancient as civilization itself. This myth of descent reinforced Venice's self-fashioning as a state of primeval harmony and endurance. The image of Antenor thus evokes Venice's heroic past before inviting viewers to partake in the pleasure for which the city was notoriously famed. At first glance, the following 7 images depict scenes of the blameless pursuits of Venetian private life. Despite rigid hierarchies of dress and decorum governed through sumptuary laws, Pietro's prints highlight the lack of distinction between fashion of noblewomen and courtesans in practice. Each of these engravings contain minute flaps, almost imperceptible to the viewer. However, the lifting of these coverings exposes the scandalous nature of these women, revealing their identities as courtesans. The flaps teasingly guarantee the sexual licentiousness and availability of each courtesan. Therefore, the flap allows a single image to present juxtaposing identities of Venice. Showcasing civic pride, the images of the courtesans without their flap rays depict a place of public repute. The more ribald nature for which the city was famed is hidden underneath, demanding physical user interaction and directly implicating the viewer rather than the city of Venice in his own sexual misconduct. Before we delve into the function of these images within the album, I want to quickly show the tactility of these prints. So here we have an image of a noblewoman in sumptuous dress. However, upon lifting the flap, we can see that she is actually a courtesan. And this is because she is wearing a codpiece. And in fact, cross-dressing was a common activity of courtesans in Venice during this time, who delightfully played and enjoyed subverting gender norms. The first flap image in this book depicts 3 masked carnival revelers. 2 men in rich clothing and feather hats leads a sumptuously dressed woman by the arm in the middle of a square. The woman's dress contains a flap that can be lifted to reveal a short skirt and platform shoes known as chopins, fashionable among Venetian noblewomen and courtesans to protect their dresses from dirt. The scene presents an alluring image of individuals disguised by masks who play out their fantasies together. In a similar suit, the flap invites the reader to amuse himself with the courtesan by engaging in a game of innuendos that mirrors what courtesans and suitors would have done in real life. Opening the courtesan series with a carnival scene is significant, as the festival itself embodied both Venice's libertine spirit and civic order. Although it's often remembered at a popular level for its transgressive nature based on social, generational, and hierarchical reversal, the government of Venice was directly involved in the interpretation and control of Carnival imagery. In 1550, Carnival fell under the supervision of the Ragion Vecchie, a government office that organized pageants, festive decorations, entertainments for the event. The widespread public acquiescence to such patrician control demonstrates how the revelry and joy of the carnival goers is not unbridled, but rather tempered by the state. Thus, Pietro's Carnival engraving presents an image of Venice as a place where subversive celebration and civic order live again in balanced harmony. Pietro's Courtesan series concludes with an engraving of a senatorial barge that recalls the themes present in the engraving of the tomb of Antenor. The images of Venice that reveal the parts of the city's salacious identity are therefore contextualized within stately scenes of civic pride. Thus, the tolerant, libertine, and at times bawdy nature for which the city was famed is framed within the state's government and values. Sansovino lauded the effects of the Venice's government, explaining how modesty and sumptuary laws sustained a culture of harmony, writing, "Freedom was never troubled, and that was due to her lofty government." The government, which Sansovino explicitly praises, is depicted by Pietro in his image of the senatorial barge in front of St. Mark's Square. The stately barge, known as the Bucentoro, is portrayed before landmarks vital to the city's civic identity, such as the Ducal Palace, St. Mark's Basilica, and the Columns of Justice. Venice's government, however, is conveyed not only through the depictions of the city's famous landmarks, but also through the size of the senatorial barge itself. The immense size of the Bucentaurial is revealed through its scalar relation to the 38 covered gondolas in the lagoon. The covered gondolas, which previously in the series housed scenes of ill repute, are made minuscule in comparison, providing an illustrative example of the moral fortitude of the Venetian state. In this image, we can see how the closed flap shows a Venetian bride accompanied by her chaperone on her way to her wedding. However, when the flap is raised, we can see that it is indeed a courtesan and her swain who is fondling her breasts and leaning in for a kiss. However, no flap is included in this final image to convey the belief that the city's government is one of harmony and justice without a tawdry underbelly to be revealed, bringing the playful and lustful nature of the courtesans to an end. The final image of Pietro Bertelli's courtesan series reminds the viewer of how the liberty enjoyed by all those in Venice was due to the direct intervention of a government and culture that subordinated individual desires in the interest of civic concordance. Taking influence from Sigismund von Herberstein's exhaustive description of Muscovite identity in a growing Russian state, the compiler characterizes Venice as a cultural center of an expanding world. He places emphasis not on the city's declining identity as a dominant political or economic center, but rather on the longevity of Venice as a place of civic concordance and harmonious juxtaposition. His display of choreographic maps and costumes allow the early modern viewer to cobble together even a fragmentary understanding of an unknown place. The confluence of costume and cartography thus became a way for our compiler to mitigate a sense of Venetian identity in a changing state. The compiler reaffirms his Venetian identity by drawing from the diversity of the city. Therefore, the print album serves not only to help the viewer navigate the scope of a changing globe, but also the socially varied urban context of Venice itself, in which courtesans, patricians, commoners, and foreigners all coexisted in multi-ethnic communities. Negotiating differences of language, religion, and customs is a daily part of early urban life, and this Venetian compiler, in an enthusiastic project of civic promotion and definition, constructed a lasting representation of the city's unique sense of Venezianita.
Thank you so much, Eunice, for that fascinating paper. My next task is to introduce Chloé Glass. Chloé is a classically trained French-American art historian and early career curator of works on paper, having received her BA with distinction from Yale University in 2022, an MA with distinction from the Courtauld Institute of Art in 2023, specializing in critical race art history. She's a research associate in the Prints and Drawings department at the Art Institute of Chicago, with a focus on old master works on paper.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Nicola. And good afternoon, and thank you to Irene and Bianca for inviting me as well and organizing our schedule today. I'm really excited to open our symposium by decoding the works of Stefano della together. So in 1633, Florentine printmaker Stefano della traveled to Rome under the patronage of Lorenzo de' Medici, that same year witnessing the arrival of the Polish embassy to the Eternal City. 12 years later, in 1645, Della again observed the Polish entourage, this time in Paris, having settled in the city after accompanying a representative of the Grand Duke Ferdinando II. Della illustrated both political events, the former through a series of etchings seen here, and the latter in 14 graphite and wash drawings. He incorporated some elements from these processional panoramas into a series of etchings published circa 1651 in Paris, and which are the focus of my research today. These 11 etchings each present an elaborately dressed man carrying weapons, astride a horse with secondary figures and architectural and topographical details in the background. The series itself consists of 3 sets, 4 etchings of men historically cataloged as Hungarians, 4 Poles, and 3 known as Black men or Ottomans. While the entire series is about othering certain peoples, I will focus on the etchings of the 3 Black men in particular, as these works seem to cause the most confusion. I first came across the series when cataloging works at the Art Institute, and they were sometimes described as Black men, Ottomans, or Turks, signifiers that shifted depending upon the author. I'd recently completed my master's in modernism and critical race theory at the Courtauld, and this seemed like an apt place to apply a more critical lens to old master works. Analyses of this series, however, often treat it at face value. In a 1944 article, 17th century specialist Julius Held labeled the prints as, quote, neutral costume studies. Phyllis Dearborn Masser, one of the foremost della experts, characterized the print of the horse rider facing left specifically as presenting a scene with, quote, authenticity. More recently, in 2022, a similar print by della depicting 4 men with turbans and 1 black man was described by a curator as, quote, not politically motivated. Such descriptions, however, flatten these works and ignore both the complexity of European society in the 17th century and the deliberate artistic choices made when constructing these presentations of different ethnicities for European audiences. In creating these figures, della incorporated motifs borrowed from earlier works on paper, including panoramic landscapes, costume studies, and travel books, alongside his own direct observation. I aim to decode these embedded motifs, especially as they act as signifiers of religion, class, and phenotype, 3 characteristics of what scholars Dr. Leah Markey and Noemi Ndiaye have coined, quote, the racial matrix of early modern Europe. The goal of this paper, then, is to analyze della Horse Rider series, and these works in particular, as circulating prints embedded within a common visual language constructing identity, particularly from the perspective of an artist working in the noble courts of both France and Florence. And I'm particularly excited to share this research here today, as Colnaghi has exhibited a selection of della etchings in 1957, including Horse Rider facing left. And we'll start with this print, actually. And you see behind the rider a domed building topped with an upside-down crescent and flanked by 3 minarets, which lies nestled at the foot of the mountain range far behind him. The building resembles the etching of the Hagia Sophia Grand Mosque by Israel Sauvestre and published by Israel Henriette between 1636 and 1661 in Paris. Part of a series of views of landscapes beyond France, Israel's etching comes at the end of a widely known visual trope of round buildings signifying paganism, and one with which della certainly would have been familiar, especially as he was embedded in the network of print publishers in Paris. Here, in particular, the crescent moon signals the Muslim Ottoman Empire. In his print, however, without the aid of descriptive captions, della relied on such recognizable motifs to identify these men as Muslim Ottomans. The crescent is visible on the 2 other prints on the horse's bridle and martingale. While the central equestrian figures do dominate the majority of the picture plane, the architectural details hidden in the background and the iconography act as important markers of identity. Masser, however, stated that the inclusion of the mosque and the palm trees lent the scene more authenticity without questioning the purpose of the motifs nor the idea of the authentic itself. A contemporary print of the Polish embassy's entrance to Paris similarly highlights the Ottoman members and Islamic motifs. Engraved by François Compillon and published by Nicolas Béret, the image presents the wedding feast of the Polish king and newly anointed queen on the upper plate and the ambassadors on the lower plate, among whom walk 2 mustachioed men, wearing close-fitting caps topped with crescents and holding curved blades. Above their heads is inscribed the phrase, the 2 Turks following the squire. These Turks, however, are lighter skinned, whereas the men with Islamic motifs in della series are presented with darker skin shaded by cross-hatching lines. Furthermore, the crescent symbol in della etchings were often paired with weapons, tying into contemporary political fears, as Barbary and Turkish corsairs were known to raid coastal European towns and enslave inhabitants. In 1644, della had personified Barbary, as a young. In 1644, della had personified Barbary as a young black man holding a lance and wearing a feathered headdress. The caption described Barbary as, quote, held by pirates under the protection of the Turks. This card was part of a commission set for the young Louis XIV, illustrating peoples around the world. Le Jeu de la Géographie, with captions written by the court poet, were intended as a didactic tool both for the king and the wider French public, imparting lessons on not only the geography, but the morality of certain peoples. Both the card game and della Horse Rider series emphasized the political threat posed by the Ottoman Empire. In fact, members of the Ottoman cavalry wielded arrows and lances in combat, and Della, in his 1633 etching of the Polish embassy, noted that the 5 Turkish horses were laden with bows, arrows, maces, and other weapons of war, with jeweled bridle and shoes of gold. Again, this link between this elaborate dressing and weapons of war motif repeated in his etching on the right here. Della was able to convey these nuanced associations without captions, in part because his etchings echo the composition of travel books, and in doing so, assume an authoritative voice. Among the many books of global travels printed in the 16th and 17th centuries was Leo Africanus's Historiale Description de l'Afrique, published by Christophe Plantin in 1556. Africanus's volumes introduced European viewers to inhabitants of the African continent. His dense descriptions were illustrated with images presenting a single figure wearing clothing representative of that culture, and we will return to the importance of stripes on this figure later. Here, the rider from Fez, Morocco, holds a lance atop a rearing horse, a composition Della again reused across the 3 black riders. This horse rider series, published at a moment in the 17th century when Poland and France were entering an alliance and the young Louis XIV was preparing to assume the throne from his regent mother, thus participates in a wider tradition of works on paper as indexing foreign rivals. The second work I'd like to focus on presents a man astride a horse before the monumental structure of the pyramid, while people on foot and horseback disappear into the background. This battle train, in particular, resembles a detail from Della's drawing of the Polish embassy, which includes bulky wagons. In the etching, however, Della has transformed these boxy wagons into an elephant. He draws our attention to the animal as the horse lifts up its right foreleg, the crook of its ankle joint pointing to the elephant. This gesture between the black rider and the elephant evokes the allegorical representation of the 4 continents, a rich visual tradition with which Della and his audience would have been familiar, especially through Medici-sponsored paintings and court spectacles. In fact, Jacopo Ligozzi's painting, installed in the Palazzo Vecchio in 1592, presents a papal coronation in the foreground, while asserting the global power of the Medici in the background through the allegory of the continents. A personification of Florence as a fully clothed woman wearing a crown and holding a scepter stands at the center of the group, including Africa as a nude woman sitting alongside a tusked elephant visible on the right-hand side. This scene aims to position the Medici family and Europe as the political center, compared to the peripheral figures of Africa, Asia, and America, who are half nude and represented by exotic animals, Asia with a camel, and Americas with an armadillo in the lower right corner. The Medici further emphasized these allegorical associations and their own political dominance in public spectacles, as seen in this print from 1615 by Jacques Callot. Here, Callot presents the chariots in a court festival in Florence, the African chariot pulled by 2 elephants. In fact, the elephants in this instance were not real, but rather donkeys or horses or even men disguised as elephants, which the mere suggestion of the animal sufficient for audience recognition. As scholar Angelica Groom has noted, quote, "The rare flora and fauna represent an allusion to the exotic bounty that could potentially be sourced for the Medici court," end quote. The tusks of elephants in particular were considered a luxury and highly coveted by members of the Medici family, who built an extension collection of carved ivory sculptures. Elephants thus signaled the material bounty that Europeans envisioned sourcing from the African continent, a form of colonialist extraction manifested in the transatlantic slave trade, of course, but also visualized in the arts. By 1650, ornamental, quote, blackamoor tableware, decorative arts with generalized representations of Africans in subservient positions, were beginning to grow in popularity. David Bindman, an editor of the series The Image of the Black in Western Art, has suggested that Della's horse rider etchings, such as this, were possible interpretations for such ornamental wares. In fact, the circular framing of these prints, with the clearly silhouetted men and horses at center, evoke painted porcelain dishes. This is really emphasized by the fact that one impression has been cut not along its square plate mark, but the round framing, so that the print exists really in the form of a plate almost, an impression which is held in the British Museum's collection. The presence of an elephant in this print thus not only embeds Della's image within the trope of animal allegory used to personify the African continent, but also reinforces the notion that both the animals and peoples were objects to be commodified, ideas emphasized in the third and final print of this subset. Horse Rider and Boy presents not only the central figure on horseback, but a second figure also in the foreground. A young black boy wears a vertically striped garment and holds a leopard pelt in front of his chest, his eyes looking beyond the picture plane to the left. Of the entire series, this is the only plate in which a secondary character stands beside the main figure and holds as much presence. This smaller figure possibly comes from a pair of young boys in Della Polish drawings on the bottom of the screen here, who walk alongside the entourage of horses and their riders, their heads barely reaching the horse's flank. In his later etching, the figure stands to the side, his head also hardly rising to the horse's chest, and his legs and feet hidden by the circular framing of the print. In Della Bella's 1633 etching of the Polish entourage on the top here, the only visible black figure in the entire series is a young man leading a camel, again, this exotic animal, and walking alongside an older figure wearing prominently striped clothing. And again, we're going to return to this idea of stripes. Della Bella may have combined the imagery from these two series to create the figure in the etching, both the stature of the young boys and the striped clothing. Black individuals were often pushed below or behind the main figure, their body used as pictorial convention for defining space and affirming the elevated status of the main subject. Della Bella himself had used this hierarchy in other works, including an etching from 1644 presenting the Queen of Sheba from the card Game of Queens, and a drawing from the 1650s of a costume study for Hypermestra performed at the Medici court. Both works present a young black man serving a central white figure. Della Bella has carefully shaded the figures' faces with cross-hatching lines and a dark wash. In these two works, the boy similarly holds a garment that obscures half his body. In the Horse Rider series, the boy stands at attention to the side of the rider, wearing matching clothes. This is an early visual example of a young black page alongside a noble master, a motif that would later become ubiquitous in European art, in which an enslaved individual is a signifier of wealth and status. Marika Knowles, in her book Analyzing the Human Figure in French Art, notes that pages, quote, served a decorative role and function as a kind of living heraldry for their masters. Here, the vibrant vertical stripes act as a type of visual token or insignia. Stripes, as Michel Pasteur's analysis of the visual structure demonstrates, are a depreciating mark used on figures that transgress the social order. Traditionally employed during the Middle Ages as a diabolic mark, Pasteur notes that by the 16th century, stripes were used primarily in a domestic context on pages, valets, and black slaves, primarily by Italian artists. Pasteur notes, quote, these stripes expressed simultaneously Oriental origin, pagan birth, and servile condition. The striped garments and Della Bella's etchings therefore set these black men apart as other, an iconography that had already been well established, including in Africanus's travel book. The accompanying text by Plantin, published by Plantin, noted that the inhabitants of Fez with striped tunics, quote, wear garments woven from foreign wool. The word étranger in French means both foreign in the sense of a person from a place far away and an unfamiliar or strange concept. Stripes were thus a visual way of demarcating individuals who did not belong to the social order. However, the only individuals wearing stripes in Della Bella's Horse Rider series are the black men, and they always show their face. Some of the Poles and Hungarians face away from the viewer as they look out at the landscape below, thus hiding their faces. In their case, their plumed hats and billowing robes stand completely in their stead. However, in contrast, Della Bella always presents the faces of the black men and always in relation to stripes, suggesting that this distinct visual pattern functions only in tandem with the ethnicity of the subject. Della Bella's interest in the physiognomy of black individuals is evidenced in these sketches of figures and headdresses in Windsor's royal collection. These graphite and wash drawings are seen here on the bottom row. These graphite and wash drawings pay close attention to the contours of an individual's forehead, chin, and nose, features Della Bella later emphasized in the etchings on the top row by contrasting the skin of the equestrian figures against a cloudless sky. The black men are also twice presented in profile in this etched series, a positioning that contributor to Image of the Black in Western art and French art historian Jean-Michel Nassim has noted is a traditional way to suggest ethnic characteristics. Compared to the prints of the Poles and Hungarians, these men are presented in a more stiff and silhouetted positioning. The careful attention to the modeling of the models' faces, really evidenced also by their eyes and the way that Della kind of captures the emotion on their faces, suggests that the artist drew these quasi-portraits from life, carefully studying an individual likely either associated with the Medici or French courts. The figures in these drawings also wear striped clothing, particularly noticeable in the woman on the right, with these puffed red and white sleeves, which really resemble the sleeves above. I've put these etchings and these drawings together not to suggest a one-to-one correlation, but really to demonstrate how Della is constructing these etchings, where they seem to be connected in some way to individuals he's sketched at court, and incorporated components from their clothing, the stripes and the headdresses. So again, really showing how these etchings are a construction both from observation of the Polish entourage and his own, and observation of court spectacles and Della horse rider series continued to circulate within European printed culture. The image of the horse rider and page seems to have been the most frequently copied. Both Johanna Christina Kusel and her cousin Johanna Sibylla Kusel created prints after it, which were published in Augsburg by Jeremiah Wolff. Stephanie Leach's chapter, Cosmopolitan Renaissance, Prints in the Age of Exchange, discusses the effects of such cross-cultural copying, noting that repeating and recycling such imagery creates collective knowledge. Stripes are a visual pattern indicating hierarchy and belonging. Della use of these oft-repeated motifs allowed his prints to be legible to a wider audience, both in France and in Germany. And in this case, the print also contains religious and political imagery, with the Islamic symbol of the crescent moon, and as well as bows, arrows, and lances as weapons of war, exotic animal imagery, the leopard skin held in the page's arms, and the elephant behind it in the background, and the image of the black attendant on the margin. Given that these prints are composite motifs borrowed from other printmakers, as well as Della own observation, rather than attempting to read them as authentic representations of certain peoples, I hope to have instead demonstrated how these prints are embedded within and reinforce visual tropes related to religion and ethnicity in early modern Europe. In fact, these prints resist fixed, rigid definitions of identity that have sometimes been ascribed to the histories of early modern Europe. Della in particular found himself at the epicenter of an increasingly globalized world, working across Florence, Livorno, which was at one point the site of the largest building in Europe for holding enslaved people, Rome, and Paris. In these two major metropolitan areas in particular, he observed political spectacles such as the procession of the Polish ambassadorial entourage, elements of which he returned to again and again in his oeuvre, and combined with his own fantastical compositions for theater, as well as established and legible motifs. Just as Della borrowed elements from popular printmakers, so too were his works quoted by others, often directly. These motifs were thus continually recycled and repeated, playing a part in the development of certain tropes, such as the black figure on the margin of portraits and in decorative arts. And in fact, further study could include analyzing Della intersection with tableware, given the resemblance of the etching to a plate, and especially as he himself drew numerous examples of decorative objects featuring Black individuals as seen here. The growing field of animal studies also provides exciting opportunities as he continually pairs figures, especially Black figures, with horses, elephants, and camels. As the field of pre-modern critical race studies continues to develop, Della's vast oeuvre provides ample material for more deeply examining how race, religion, and class were visualized in early modern Europe, and I look forward to continuing to analyze his works and to your feedback as well. Finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Art Institute of Chicago and the Newberry Library for supporting my research, as well as those at the Courtauld Gallery, Royal Collection, and British Museum, who facilitated my close-looking sessions in their study rooms earlier this week. Thank you.
Our first speaker, Emily Cadger, is a PhD candidate in art history, visual art and theory program at the University of British Columbia. She's an adjunct lecturer at the University of Western Washington also. Her current research is funded by a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Doctoral Research Award. Sorry, it's a mouthful. She's the recipient of the Killam Graduate TA Award and was most recently the North American Victorian Studies Association Canadian Graduate Representative. She's presented her work at the College Art Association, the British Association for Victorian Studies, and the Modern Language Association, among other places. Her most recent publication, The Milliner's Fairy Tale, appears in The Milliner's Daughter, The Art and Practice of Edessa Pendulis, which was edited by Ernst van Alphen and Mika Baum. So without further ado, hand over to you.
Sound more impressive on paper than what we're about to see. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you for inviting me to this. I just want to give a shout out to the Social Sciences, Humanities and Research Council of Canada, who funded this project, and then also to Dr. Christina Smeltopoulos, who may or may not have logged on at this early time in BC, who basically gave me free rein in the archives and was the first one to let me loose when I was technically supposed to be doing research for her book, where I was able to find some of these prints at the Houghton. So today I'm going to be discussing a set of books by the English socialist artist Walter Crane, which are known as his flower books. And they're this weird little collection of 5 books in his oeuvre that kind of span the years right after he kind of came out and declared himself a socialist up until 1906, when he became very disillusioned with the world and how socialism had basically failed and the world hadn't ended and restarted after 1901. And so what I'm going to be looking at today, in particular, while these books are super fascinating and I have a favorite, which I'm not going to talk about today, I can't talk about all of them here because you guys need to leave and go home at some point, and we have other wonderful papers. I'm going to be focusing on the first one in particular, which is kind of the nascent, the baby, where he's testing out a lot of these theories about what it means to kind of insert socialist imagery into books for children, and kind of starting to deal very heavily with making the nursery a political activist space instead of this kind of apolitical place of childhood, which people were trying to say that it was at this particular point in time, and kind of we've inherited that idea as well. So the flower books in particular are where he kind of gets to curate the images and the text for some of the first time as his career. I've labeled him in some of my larger research as a pragmatic socialist. He comes up from a very kind of lower middle class family. He's not like William Morris, who has a lot of money. So he's not able to stout all these kind of big theories and then kind of not have to pay attention to them because he's got all this hereditary money that he can fall back on. He's got multiple children. He's got a wife at home pressuring him to become a royal academician, which never really works out, which she doesn't kind of let him forget about. And then he's also got to like support this family and as well as some of his younger siblings. So he enters socialism at a very different kind of level than a lot of the peers that he's working with and the people that he looks up to kind of brought him into this movement. And so he's trying to balance this idea of commercialization with these socialist ideals where he's like, everyone should have the ownership of their own labor and the commerce that comes with it. He's very outspoken against the British Empire, and then he starts to lose a lot of shows and contracts because of this. And so the flower books are the first time where we start to see him actually be able to insert some of these larger ideas into his work, and how he starts to kind of finagle this process of putting very politically charged iconography and imagery into these commercial objects that people are then buying. And then he's able to keep his livelihood. In particular, I'm going to be focusing on this this double page spread from Flora's Feast from 1889. And in particular, I'm going to be looking at the poppy figures and the kind of comparison between these early preparatory sketches that the Houghton at Harvard has versus this final published version of what it looks like, because the initial sketches are vastly different from what we see here with these Indian sepoys that are kind of marching toward our ox-eye Daisy and her little cow. very kind of quintessentially English flowers, very much attached to like daisies and Chaucer's daisies, something that he plays up not only in this book, but in later versions of these books as well. So just a bit more of background before we kind of go into what the original drawing looks like. Crane is very adamant that there shouldn't be a British Empire, and I'm going to put some like asterisks next to that, because while he's coming out and saying this, he's also very much participating in a lot of this empirical trade and a lot of materials from this, and he's also very specific about India not being a colony, which is why I'm looking at this, when he kind of starts being asked about, oh, what about what we're doing in like Asia and like other countries. He kind of like backs away and doesn't really write down a lot of these thoughts, but in 1906 he actually goes to India, and he comes back and he writes and publishes his journals from there, where he basically kind of reiterates ideas that he put out in the early 1870s, and then in the 1880s and 1890s, where he's like, we shouldn't have British India, we need to fix this. We've basically ruined their agricultural products, and we've taken over all of their arts and crafts. He was very against what had happened, particularly with paisley prints in India, and basically Britain coming in, taking those patterns and traditional ways of making craft, bringing them back to England, and then industrializing them, basically wiping out this entire kind of handcraft movement, which he thought was the kind of pinnacle of what art should be. Like, it shouldn't be arts and crafts, it should just be everything. There shouldn't be hierarchies. And India was kind of this example that he held up as this kind of the biggest kind of victim of the imperial class system that's happening. So most of the images in this particular book appear like this. They're very fantastical. He's basically taken a lot of these flowers that are either natural to Britain and the kind of United Kingdom islands, or he's taken flowers like the tulips that we have here that don't originate in England, but were naturalized sometime between the late 1500s to early 1700s, and now are considered kind of like quintessential flowers in an English garden. If you didn't have them, you weren't cultivating the ground properly enough. And even some of the ones like the lilies that had appeared in like the 1600s from the Ottomans were very much kind of whitewashed flowers in this kind of foreign background that these, they're kind of natural, these foreign kind of natural roots are kind of whitewashed away in these illustrations, except for the actual poppies themselves. He does add here in his little political imagery, we've got our little Phrygian bonnets for our socialists, our little tulips that are there, that's just kind of a little salting one. But here he kind of goes a bit more into this kind of like hard-hitting empirical ideas. So the poppies are the only figures in this entire book, and in most of the other books until we get to this, the last one, that has a darker skin color than any of the other flowers. Even in the preparatory drawings, they're shaded as slightly lighter than what we end up with the actual finished product. And one of the things that becomes very clear when you look at these kind of prep drawings versus this final one, which I'll show you now, is that the original iteration of the poppies were actually supposed to be farmers. It looks like these original poppies were supposed to be connected to the common poppy, which is a natural poppy in England, the one that you find in farm fields. Flanders poppy is the other kind of quintessential name for it, very much connected even at this time to this idea of the English countryside and the identity there. However, what we see Crane actually doing with these works is we see him kind of switching this idea when he starts doing this in 1888. We see him switching this between 1888 and 1889 before the final publication for the Christmas season in 1889, from this more kind of agricultural friendly idea to this more militant image that we get in the end. So Crane was very much aware of the kind of the fecundity and fertility symbol of the poppies around agriculture at this time. He wrote quite a bit about the idea of farmers. He thought being a farmer was one of the kind of quote unquote best socialist jobs that you could have, because you're supporting the community with your labor, and you also own your labor. He's very outspoken against the new kind of industrial levels of farming that we're starting to get. And then don't even get him started on what's happening with empirical industrial agriculture in the rest of the colonies. So I argue throughout this paper and some of my larger work that The flower books are actually one of the only places where Crane is not being criticized for adding some of his empirical ideas and theories into these pages, because no one's really looking at them as political objects. We don't really get to see them being looked at as political objects until Morna O'Neill kind of looks at one of them like in the 2010s as the first time where these flower books are brought out as something that isn't just like aesthetically pleasing or imaginative fantasies for children. They're actually like hard-hitting political imagery that's connected to his larger oeuvre of painting. And he's an artist that kind of gets kind of separated across a bunch of different categories in art history, which really led to a lot of the kind of impact and intermediality across his own oeuvre being kind of lost after like the 1890s when he kind of disappeared from public view. Wasn't helped that 1901 Colnaghi basically came out and being like, he can die now. He's accomplished everything he needed to do as an artist. And he's still got like 16 years left of his life and he's creating stuff, and he was not very happy with that. So we see in these images here where we're making this direct switch. And so in the original preparatory drawings, the headdress in particular is one that's very interesting. Crane had made a number of notes on the costumes and the peasant kind of clothing of farmers in India, as well as this kind of comparison to what peasant farmers in Scotland and Northern England would wear. A little classes, but it works out for him in the end. And so one of the things that he comments on in his writings on these actual books is that he doesn't want to follow this kind of language of flowers that's become very popular in Britain. He doesn't think that this emotive kind of connotation and morality that we're seeing with this Christian socialism and work by Kate Greenaway, where you're basically supposed to have one kind of meaning attached to a flower and you follow with that. He thinks that's not doing service to botanical illustration. It's not doing service to the kind of purpose and the messages that flowers can have, as well as other plants. So he basically writes that he wants to focus on the actual form of these objects and talk about the particularities of the plants as if the form, the shape, and the line of these plants can give you a better idea of the characteristics of the botanical specimens in a similar way that you would study the line and form of fabric as you start to put it into a costume and get the idea of what that's supposed to be. So he has multiple notes on what these kind of quote unquote peasant garments should be. We notice that in particular that the headdresses, they switch from this more kind of bonnet style that you can see here that is very much attached to the French artist that he's been studying at this time as well. And this kind of shepherd's hook cross that he talks about wanting to include in these kind of agricultural images. And then in the final published image, we get a bit more of a very kind of militaristic tricorn that we have here, which is very reminiscent of the British East India Company that's taking place in India. We also very much have him kind of being obsessed with the events of 1857 and this idea of the Indian sepoys, right when Crane's starting to become an illustrator and kind of making these money and getting the training. He's being asked quite a bit to kind of illustrate these very racially coded ideas across the colony, which he kind of declines or at least doesn't put a signature on. And he talks about in some of his biography where he got paid for things that he didn't take credit for. And so this is starting to appear here, and we see this very distinct move from this very agricultural focused image to a more militaristic one. And what the biggest kind of signifier that this is probably something commenting on the British Empire and the opium crisis that's going on right now and the agricultural crisis at this time is the kind of focus on the head of the poppy here, which is not in this original image at all. So to make opium from these particular poppies, this is the part of the plant that's the most important. The head is where all of the milk juice, because I can't translate the Latin properly of this, comes from that actually makes the drug itself. And Crane's very much against this particular type of drug, but he's also very much against the kind of forced industrial farming that's happening in India and being placed on these citizens to make this happen. At this time, Britain's going into these agricultural areas in India, in the British India, and they're basically wiping out a lot of the very common native plants there. This is around the same time that we're seeing a lot of the kind of more traditional coffee plants that used to grow there and were native there being wiped out to put different type of imported tea there from China. And we're seeing this with India as well. We've got a number of incentives from the government coming in as well to have people paid a very high premium to kind of get rid of the natural agricultural products that they have and replace them with these poppies. And then they'll get these kind of top-ups for growing this particular type of plant. And we see that he's already kind of struggling with how to, wrong slide, struggling with how to kind of depict these at the bottom here, where he's already started trying to figure out how do you kind of separate agriculture and these kind of poppies here. And one of the things that happens in 1889 is we get our commission for India that comes in, and basically it's this commission that appears and is formed in London, and they have their own print journal where they're basically trying to push more for Indian independence at this time. So they're the journal and the commission comes out and they're trying to get more awareness of what is actually happening in India from the British Empire, because a lot of this news is being very whitewashed and politically de-escalated. And Crane was very much aware of this. He was also at the 1886 Indian colonial exhibition that was there as well. He bought a number of maps there. He also purchased a lot of paraphernalia and was very invested in what was happening in the colonies. And so I believe that at this time when this is happening, particularly when the commission is coming in, particularly when there's a lot of kind of upheaval that's happening, we're also at this in 1880 and 1889 about to get a bunch of sanctions from China as well, who's trying to stop a lot of this illegal trade and legal trade that is happening. And so we end up with this, and I think the pairing in this becomes very significant, as he could have separated these in a very different way, or even if he not changed the poppies from from the agriculture into this militant, it would have been a very different book. So in this particular ones, when you're in farm fields, when you're in meadows, the common poppy and the oxeye daisy actually grow very well together. They're both pollinators. They basically sustain a lot of the bee and pollinator life that we have in the kind of wildernesses of the UK and Canada. And so they would have paired just as well if it hadn't been a militarized image. But what Crane's done here is he's taken this very particular set of figures and put them almost in this more threatening dialogue that's happening as well. There's a number of kind of sub-political groups, more kind of the anarchist side, and then as well as some individuals in Parliament at this time who are kind of pushing for more kind of military investment in India, who are worried that there's going to be another uprising as we get closer to the end of the century. And Crane's very much pushing back against this. We're kind of getting in the next decade, in 1900, we'll get the Boer Wars, which Crane will actually leave a number of societies, including the Fabians, when they come out and they say they actually support the Boer War. And he's like, we shouldn't be making war as an empire anyways. So he cuts ties with them. And we start to see him really push this idea of demilitarization of the empire and kind of stepping away from this. And here we have kind of facing each other, this very kind of more innocent English hares with her little cow, this shepherdess with the crook that is very similar to what the crook would have looked like in the original Poppy sketch if he hadn't changed it. And instead she's having her space kind of encroached on across the gutter of the book, across this border here when you spread it open, by these very militant figures. And this is one of the only spreads in this book where we actually have two of the flowers looking at each other. Most of them are looking forward in this procession, because you're supposed to flip through this like a parade, so you follow through the parade with them. And this is one of the only illustrations in the book where we actually have the two figures almost making eye contact. The other one is a mother and child kind of figure near the end. And Crane's very much aware of a lot of the kind of medical ideas going around with poppies, but he's also aware of the kind of connections to Demeter and to the gods around this. He doesn't always depict poppies. They become one of his biggest symbols that he uses, but he doesn't always depict them in this kind of militaristic way. He very much connects them to agriculture. They become this big kind of symbol of socialism and revival and falling asleep. And this book is a very odd kind of entrance into this oob where he's kind of really taking a step back away from this. We know that he understands this kind of connection to pollination, this connection to agriculture, to like good agriculture, as he calls it at this time. We know he can depict it this way, and yet he's choosing not to do it. Morna O'Neill also has made this connection through a number of her work, particularly in his socialist work, where he kind of upholds farming as this ideal industry that socialists should be a part of, and that a craftsman can also be a farmer and vice versa. And she notes that in some of his most popular work, particularly his canvas paintings, the poppy and the cornfield are poppy and the wheat field are often sandwiched together. They're connected in this way to demonstrate that this is a very fertile ground. We're having this springtime coming. You can't have this kind of procession into a socialist community without this kind of pairing together. And that's completely erased in this book. It appears in his other books as this other kind of springtime. This is his other flower book, where the poppy figure appears again as this kind of flower of fertility and fecundity, and then it's just kind of disappears. And so we know that Crane is very interested in the empire. He comments on this quite heavily in his socialist work. He's known as the artist of socialism. So his actual print works that are coming in newspapers and magazines are following a lot of the same iconography that we have here. He's very much against this imperial intervention. And it shows up in some of his earlier works as well, where he's very much taking a lot of this contemporary empirical studies and news and incorporating them into his actual illustrated books for children. This one was not as successful. He was a little too overt with some of the criticisms later on. Oh, I've got 30 seconds left. He's a little more on the nose with some of this criticism in this particular book and in some of his other earlier works, which leads to a lot of it being pulled. His publishers aren't very happy about it, which kind of culminates in this imperial map that comes out just a couple of years before Flora's Feast. And Crane didn't actually take credit for this. It wasn't until the early 2000s when Pippa built Cliff noticed that his signature was attached to this. He'd been approached to make this. It was a very well-paying job. We find out from his son in his biography. And there is a kind of reworking of the British Empire around the borders here. Atlas, who's holding up the world, is holding it up through human labor. It says this, which you can't see in his little tiny banner here. And the criticism of the kind of British Empire in India, where they're literally kind of breaking the backs of the citizens of this country, becomes very prominent here. And one of the reasons that Pippa Butcliffe and Felix Driver kind of think that he didn't take credit for this was because he needed money. And at this point, he'd come out as a socialist. He'd had a number of paintings pulled the year prior because he came out and he's against the British Empire very strongly, and then very strongly for socialism. And he had a number of paintings rejected from galleries, and he lost a lot of money. And this coincides exactly with this graphic publication as well. So we see him having to be very pragmatic about what he's having to do. And then in 1889, connected to all these empirical ideas, we see him kind of inserting this in a much more aesthetically pleasing way than we see with a lot of the other works. It's a little more hidden. And we see this starting to develop in a lot of his oeuvre as well, where he's kind of taking these very apolitical ideas of beauty and aestheticism, which are not actually apolitical at all, and inserting them into these kind of very politically charged iconography. He writes that he thinks that children are very intelligent, and if you teach them how to read images properly, they'll know what to look for. And that starts to appear not only in his illustrated books, but in his wallpapers and all the other paraphernalia he made for the nursery as well. So I believe, and I argue with this particular one in a larger paper, that this switch from like an agricultural India, which is how he thinks it should be, it's very connected to this idea, to an industrial one, is actually a much more kind of nuanced critique of it's a much more nuanced critique of what Britain is doing as an empirical overlord in India than it's been previously given credit for or even noticed at all. And it opens up the door to kind of look at these more kind of apolitical children's books, these beautiful objects that are not political or kind of pushed to the sides of art historical study in favor for larger canvases or more kind of in-your-face socialist work, which he also did, and kind of opens up the door for us to kind of revisit these ideas and kind of look for the smaller nuances to better understand how these kind of middle class and lower class artists were actually trying to express kind of critiques of empire in ways that also kind of allowed them to have jobs and continue being artists in a time where that was very unstable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we are going to hear from Vivian Tong. She's an independent researcher and lecturer in Chinese art history at the Hong Kong Baptist University. She specializes in the study of imperial Chinese porcelain and works of art, as well as cross-cultural exchange in art between East and West. Prior to her academic career, she worked as a Chinese art specialist at a leading international auction house for over a decade, where she extensively handled and studied historical artworks firsthand. And she will be talking us today about images of nature in a global horticultural expansion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Nicola and Bianca and the Colnaghi team for inviting me. It's very exciting today to be exploring this very interesting theme in actually multiple cultural contexts. So it's very exciting. And thank you, Emily, for the very interesting presentation just now. And I'm just going to focus on the Chinese side of things and moving a little bit earlier in history. So in the latter half of the 18th century and 19th century, there was a vogue for Chinese botanical illustrations done with scientific accuracy, with specific instructions that were specially commissioned by European naturalists. The 18th century was a flourishing period for the British East India Company, short term as EIC, as it gradually overtook its Dutch counterpart, dominating trade relations with Asia. Apart from commissions of all art forms and media, the company officials working in India and China also contributed to the research and documentation of Asian natural history. They commissioned and created botanical and zoological artworks out of, first, the fascination of science and natural history, and second, also as a means to help them to understand, in some cases for commercial purposes, the areas into which the East India Company was expanding into. So these are just some examples here on the screen here. These Chinese botanical illustrations, they show our Asian artistic methods. They are very identifiable through the use of color and intricate details, but at the same time, they also show clear influence from European collectors and European instructions with the use of shading and also the way they were handled. As a result, many of these pieces are early examples of the development of a new style of painting. The first European interest in botanical taxonomy can be traced back to around the Renaissance period, where there were botanical inquiries made. And later on in the 16th century, there was a vogue to create herbals, like books of herbaceous species and also floral illustrations called the Florilegia. And further into the 17th century and 18th century, there was a whole development of global expeditions to explore and commission these botanical illustrations from across the world. And this object you will see on the screen here, it's an album from the British Museum, will show a British interest in science in the 18th century. It's an album bound in early 18th century English binding, featuring 196 drawn leaves, including many botanical drawings after Henrik Fulmura and Albrecht Meyer, who were known botanical artists, but also featuring, as you can see on the page next to it, many medical, surgical, allegorical, mythological, or biblical subjects. You can see that there was a big combination of compositions with a scientific interest. In the 18th century, it was a big flourishing moment for global trade between the East and the West. And before 1840, the British East India Company officials were only allowed to trade with China in Canton, which is on the southern part of China, with the Hong merchants, which were factory merchants stationed around the coast. These Hong merchants were very well-off people, and they lived in very big mansions with magnificent gardens in which they entertained their Western guests. So much was written and spoken about these gardens that eventually every European or American visiting Canton would make an effort to see them. Paintings such as this one here on the screen here were produced for those who did not have the opportunity to make a personal visit. And here on the screen here, you have a depiction of Hokwa's garden. And Hokwa is one of the 13 Hong merchants in Canton, who was also one of the richest men in the whole world in the early 19th century. And you will see in his garden features like very typical, like bridges and architectural structures, and also rocky outcrops, pavilions, and pots of plants here in the foreground of many varieties, showing the lush of the garden culture in China. Another watercolor from the Victoria and Albert Museum showing a scene of possibly a nursery garden, which are places where young plants are grown and nurtured for sale into the West. And you can see here that there was a garden carer with many different pots of plants of different species cultivated. And Western botanists and naturalists who were they were working closely with these nurseries, sourcing plants from the East. And these illustrations thereafter, like the botanical illustrations, would help them to navigate between the language barrier of ordering certain plants. The interest in finding, this is just a detail of the different plants that you see on the watercolor. The interest in finding species indigenous to China and India, recorded life in the exotica, and also like symbolizing global expansion in horticulture, gave rise to a lot of these botanical illustrations that were being commissioned. And a lot of these illustrations were actually sent back to the West with specimens of seeds and plants, as you can see in the Kew Gardens nowadays too, like matching them up. Another watercolor shown here, like of depicting a scene from the Great Exhibition. You can see a view of the Crystal Palace, the interior, with two figures in the foreground appreciating sort of Oriental objects and antiquities, which was also a vogue at the time. But here at the corner here, you will find two figures in front of this kind of glass case, which is traditionally called the Wardian case. These cases were revolutionary in the, facilitating the movement of plants moving from one part of the world to another. So these naturalists and botanists from the West, they would visit the Far East, source plants, and to ship them back to the West. And these glass cases preserved plant specimens for months of voyages on the deck of the ship to prevent them from withering or dying in extreme temperature conditions or limited water conditions. And you will see that they are all in vogue. It is crucial in the global horticultural expansion in British gardens, these inventions of these glass cases that were crucial to the building up and development of the Kew Gardens that you will see today. And I've got a quote here by British botanist and explorer in the 19th century by Hooker, who was describing in one of his letters how the ordering of Calcutta drawings from India, and how the herbarium was willing to pay. And you can see here, like Indian and Chinese drawings alike, it is clear that these botanical illustrations were regarded with a scientific value, and they are worthy of purchase for the future development and study of these garden developments. Taxonomic work during this period worthy of noting is that they are closely associated with economic value. In short, the commercial side of botany was actually shaped by the illustrations that were produced, prioritizing those that would make money. For example, a very influential figure, also the first unofficial director of the Kew Gardens in London, Sir Joseph Banks, was known to have commissioned a collector manual, a booklet, which he then passed on to the gardener William Kerr in 1803. Noting down species of different plants. And it was known that in this booklet, although now lost, that he has a star system to the booklet, marking the species that he particularly wanted to acquire for England. And that was unseen in British collections. And so you can see the interconnection between economy, botany, and also an imperialist sort of development of garden designs. Chinese botanical illustrations could be seen as a combination of different styles merging the East and the West. The first being the Linnean style of botanical illustration, pioneered by Carl Linnaeus and exemplified by artists like George Dionysius Ahat that you will see here on the screen, featuring very detailed depiction of plants with fine inclusion of details such as cross-sections, annotations, and also specific scientific features that are crucial to the representation of these plants. At the same time, they were combined with a long tradition of Song Dynasty paintings of bird and flower that you will see next to this on the screen, featuring combining the use of very naturalistic but also stylized form of representing plants, showing, for example, the texture of the fruit of the pomegranate and also its kind of dimpled sort of like blemishes of the fruit. Both Chinese and Indian botanical illustrations were commissioned, but they have different stylistic differences. And the Indian drawings, they were usually bold and vibrant in their colors and with more meandering of the stems and starker shadows, like more light and dark contrasts, and sometimes enhanced with gold and silver. Whereas Chinese botanical illustrations were a balance between realism and stylization. You can see that they use softer shading and more delicate and fine brushwork with occasional inclusion of insects. And some scholars would describe some of the paintings with butterflies as butterflies with powdery wings to praise on the way that the Chinese artists could convey textures. A systematic study of these paintings and their commission contexts were faced with challenges, mainly because a lot of these collections, although commissioned and handled by several key figures, including naturalists, botanists, of company officials, were dispersed in a number of collections, and many of which were mixed up, and many of which were also individual drawings were cut to desired size to fit for easier storage, and some of them were also detached from their original binding and remounted, such as those in the V&A Museum. Here are just a few examples of how they were cut, but there were many others that were also done even like rectangularly, but to fit into certain boxes. Dating by pure visual analysis is also difficult given the style persisted over a long period of time. So information gathered from other aspects, such as the watermarks that were present on imported Western paper, their styles, letter correspondences of the people involved, contemporary references, or European book plates and inscriptions were crucial to establish chronology of these paintings. Looking at British collections of Chinese botanical illustrations, there are a few key figures who played an important part in the commissioning of these. The first figure, whom we have already mentioned, is Sir Joseph Banks, who was one of the largest patrons of these drawings. The first unofficial director of the Kew, acting on behalf of King George III. His initiations of a global horticultural campaign, as you can see from the Kew Gardens in London, could be seen as attempts to include a global vision of the garden. And he has sent quite a number of people and commissioned botanical drawings to be done in Asia. accompanied by sourcing of plant species that was unknown to Britain before. A figure called John Bradley Blake was one of the earliest people who had organized for drawings to be made in China. The bulk of his collection of drawings are now in the Oak Spring Garden Foundation in Virginia and some in Natural History Museum in London. The Blake drawings featured many useful plants, such as medicine, herbs, or food, type of like fruit and vegetables type of botanical illustrations. And Blake's drawings were commissioned and made after Blake's drawings into a manual, a collector's manual by Joseph Banks, who then passed to William Kerr in the early 19th century, and to send him off on a voyage in 1803 to China in order to source species for the Kew Gardens and commission further illustrations for accuracy. A lot of these drawings sourced by William Kerr are now in the Kew Gardens. And later, Sir Joseph Banks also commissioned John Reeves Sr., who used Kerr's commissions to produce the next generation of botanical art in Canton, now majorly in the Royal Horticultural Society Reeves collection and also the National History Museum in London. Another group was pioneered by Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, who also used William Kerr to help and handle the execution of the commission for the Indian Office Library collection, which is predominantly now in the British Library. There are some examples of botanical illustrations featuring different styles. And here I'm just showing a few of them. These variations show many different botanical illustrations, but done in different styles. This, for example, is what is quite common in the Blake drawings. You can see that they are roundabout with the black border. And as I mentioned, Blake's drawings were the prototypes that were being used to create this manual, a collector's manual that was passed to William Kerr to source further drawings. So you can see that thereafter drawings commissioned by Kerr and John Reeves also share similarities of showing different parts of the plants and also the different compositions. But there are also many other variations of botanical drawings with also similarly annotations, maybe simple annotations of the plant species in Chinese and also their transliteration, but perhaps like rendered in other different ways, such as depicting plants of different stages of maturity in the natural stems and different compositions. Occasionally, there are examples with insects featured too. And here you can find like these black borders of the Blake drawings. They could possibly have some parallel, like it's quite interesting parallel with ancient Chinese manuals of depicting different species, also with the black border and also Chinese writings on them. The Canton trade system, as we said, because European officials were confined to a certain area in Canton to trade at certain periods of time, the Canton trade system posed several limitations to figures like William Kerr to source plants, because they were required to exit from Canton and reside in Portuguese-occupied Macau at that time during certain periods of the year. And that could be the reason why Chinese artists turned to Southeast Asia. Chinese artists, they turned their commission to Chinese artists active in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, in Indonesia, and Singapore. This is just a close-up of further sort of annotations that you can see in the Reeves collection. And here features a few artists who are known to produce these botanical illustrations. The majority of these illustrations are unnamed, and these artists' names were known from certain letter correspondences, and they were attributed to these artists. But you can see that there are variations in styles, and it's quite interesting, this figure here, known as Cow. He was recorded in 1828 in a letter correspondence from Robert Fullerton, describing him as, he proposed a cow, the artist, artist to transfer from Singapore to the botanical establishment at Prince of Wales Island, employed at 70 rupees per month. He was also, a cow was described in a testimonial from John Prince, described as a draftsman under the late governor of Bencoolen, and proficient in art and an exceedingly well-behaved and attentive man under the Singapore government, and recording his salary also, like during in that testimonial. It's quite interesting that Raffles, the other collector, who was also known to have employed a Chinese Macau painter who was good at painting fruits and flowers to the life in 1810 to 1811, and another letter correspondence from his wife, his late wife, also denoting that he had 5 to 6 unknown artists of unknown names also working for him in Southeast Asia. This other painting, watercolor painting that you will see on the screen, depicts a later studio in the watercolor. It's a Chinese export painting studio in the 19th century, slightly later in time, but it will provide some clues and some hints into how export painting studios run and how the painters actually conduct their work. And you can see that they were although conducting these botanical illustrations in Western styles, they actually use Chinese brushes and they hold them in the Chinese way to render these watercolors. I have also studied quite deeply into the detail of the background of the studio, featuring many different examples of export paintings. And you can see here, if you are familiar with Chinese export paintings, it features almost every single type of export painting available during that period of time, including Chinese and European figures, sometimes in interior space, and also architecture, harbor scenes and landscapes, as well as more to the Chinese style of things. But the botanical illustrations that we have seen are absent from these. And it is quite clear that these botanical illustrations are markedly different. They are very special commissions for a small group of patrons for a specific purpose. And the fact that many of them were actually rendered on special imported European paper, bearing European watermarks from paper makers, such as John Watman, who is very famous British paper maker, and also like with very close relationship with the British East India Company, were very often the medium to which these illustrations were rendered on. And also you can see here just some details of showing the lead white pigment kind of discoloring as time goes by. Although it is these botanical illustrations are very unlike other export paintings, it is still very closely related to economic and international expansion, as we have previously explored. And when we talk about international expansion and economic growth between exchanges between the East and the West, it is inevitable that we have to talk about the tea trade, which was monopolized by China for the longest period of time. There were many attempts by Europeans to, especially the Dutch and the British, who were tea lovers, to share the financial fruits of the industry. The first tea plant was successfully cultivated at the Kew Gardens, which is a very important message of nationalism, actually, of the Britons over France and Netherlands, who were having similar attempts of finding the secret to cultivate this tea plant. Here on the screen here is a set of 23 tea drawings featuring tea industry in China, commissioned by Europeans, probably the Dutch or the British, most likely the Dutch market, because one of them were rendered on a Dutch watermarked paper with Van Gelder, the paper maker. And you can see that in these depictions of how tea was being made, different processes of creating tea and processing them and making tea were actually combined with also depictions of Europeans. Here you can see different European figures represented with very dignitary sort of depictions of showing as very intellectual professionals knowing about the tea culture, conversing with Chinese dignitaries, and also inspecting, tea leaves, and also as good intellectuals participating in the tea trade. The horticultural expansion in the UK has broader political context. Amidst enterprising Victorians trying to move plant and animal species around the world, it's an intersection between commercial value, aesthetics, and scientific research in these botanical illustrations exhibiting imperialism, ideas of imperialism. But, after all, plants are not just any commodities. They were also food, medicine, and drugs, and even one with economic value, as you can see with the wrestling tea trade from China. So the imperialism behind botanical illustrations and global horticultural expansion can be summarized in a few quotes from Joseph Banks. He sees China as possessing the ruins of a state of civilization, a civilization which was reinvented by Britain and also stolen from the Chinese. And here is a quote: the great inventions which actually serve as a basis of our present state of civilization in China were known to us long before. And all these inventions of printmaking, printing, papermaking, gunpowder, and arts of working and purifying the most refractory metals were now like long gone. But he described that the porcelain production was still a secret that was unknown to Europe in the 18th century. But at the same time, he also mentioned that it is highly possible that a few practical men, admitting among them, which is the embassy of Lord Macartney when he brought a whole entourage of embassy into China, visiting the Qianlong Emperor in the 18th century. He believed that sending these people will be able to acquire a mass of information for which, if placed in the industrious and active hands of British manufacturers, the whole revenue of the Chinese empire would not be thought a sufficient equivalent. So you will be able to see that he is interested in observing and recording Chinese methods, and his notion of seeing Chinese and British Western scientific developments is actually a mixture of awe and admiration for the Chinese, but also combined with determination to overtake them and acquire these skills for Britain. And lastly, this letter, much later on in 1896, from Charles Ford to Sir William Thistleton Dyer, he expressed his weary of when there is less interest in Chinese plants, collectors will become demoralized and work on Chinese botany in Britain will decrease. He hopes that there will be support from the government and national institutions to enable China to keep up with other countries. And you can see that with the opening of the port later in the 19th century, there is less interest in China with the expansion into China already being considered to be achieved through the Opium Wars. This decline of interest in later 19th century is also a show of British nationalism, because the loss of interest in the exotica, but more focused on their own developments, is a new nationalism of the Brits, and replaced by an interest perhaps in place of the botany, botanical illustrations, perhaps photography, and also other forms of new developments in Britain. The large-scale project of a scientific exploration into the East was only made possible by inexhaustible resources of the British East India Company to hunt for plant species and subsequent movement of the plants, and also relevant illustrations of botanical depictions, and also a long passion for their executors like William Kerr and John Reeves, and also the dexterity and the skillful adaptation of Asian artists. All these will weave into a glorious chapter of British imperialism by means of horticultural expansion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is going to be joining us online. Joseph is a PhD candidate in the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University. His dissertation, entitled Natural Disaster in the Atlantic World, Aesthetics, Delight, and Risk During the Long 18th Century, examines how representations of catastrophe developed as a form of risk management that aided British imperial expansion, especially in the Caribbean. His research has been supported by the Paul Mellon Center, the Lewis Walpole Library, the Huntington Library, Oak Spring Garden Foundation, the Effron Center, and Mount Vernon. Prior to Princeton, he held curatorial positions at Crystal Bridges, Colonial Williamsburg, and the Georgia Museum of Art. So he's going to be speaking to us today about the plantation landscapes of Anne Atkins and Anna Dixon.
Thank you very much for having me. So this paper started in 2019 as a request to write a gallery label for this photograph. Neither Anna Atkins nor Anne Dixon left much of an archive, though Atkins did publish a memoir, and Dixon did edit and publish books that I will discuss later. Investigating genealogy, family connections, provenance, and historical circumstance complicated traditional narratives around this and its companions. Though a cursory glance may suggest otherwise, I will argue that these historical factors entangle with Atkins and Dixon's formal strategies to produce a plantation landscape. So there are many layers of meaning at play. Around 1853, Anna Atkins and Anne Dixon made at least 4 books of fern cyanotypes. One is at the Getty, one is at the National Science Museum, one is in a private collection, and one was dismantled by Sotheby's in 1981. Anna Atkins is, of course, well known for her 1843 Photographs of British Algae, which is the first photo-illustrated book. Anne Dixon is less well known, but was a good friend of Atkins. So the primary title page shows a bounty of ferns swirling around the calligraphic title that divides the world into 2 groups, British and foreign. 2 later title pages emphasize this divide again. The assortment of delicate curving lines is an imperial project that visualizes the colonial origins of its creation. Family investment in Jamaican coffee and sugar plantations enabled Atkins to make these and other images. Dixon's family was also entangled with colonialism, particularly in British India, where Dixon ostensibly sent these photographs. So more traditional definitions of plantation landscape might reproduce images like these. In 1820, James Hakewill made an infamous tour of Jamaica. In the images, he pays particular attention to labor, landscape, and how they interact. The composition of Trinity Estate uses few forms to create a languid narrative of effortless production. As Krista Thompson, Charmaine Nelson, Jeff Quilley, Kay Diane Kriz, and others have argued, these types of landscape are a calm and orderly showcase of fertile ground, good weather, and subservient Black people. This mode of image-making deliberately elides the anti-Black violence of Caribbean plantations to emphasize British profits. Strategic aesthetics that hide and reveal are part and parcel of the plantation. I draw on scholars including W.J.T. Mitchell and Catherine McKittrick to consider what an expanded definition of plantation landscape might look like. To consider the spatialization and aesthetics of imperial power structures. To consider how history lingers. The choices that Hakewill made in his view of Trinity Plantation were part of broader trajectories. Atkins and Dixon also made effacing maneuvers in their cyanotypes. They efface a great deal more than Hakewill, of course, but the artist made titles root, literally, the plant in a region. They create 3-dimensional space tied to physical geography. I argue that this is, to quote Merriam-Webster, a portion of territory that can be viewed at one time from one place, or a landscape. As objects, cyanotypes are made when someone carefully positions items on sheets of light-sensitive paper. It's a very simple process chemically and technically, but like an omelet or a martini, it's incredibly difficult to perfect. I've learned this the hard way. To achieve a clear result, especially in the background, like that of Atkins and Dixon on the left, requires precision and strict environmental control that I've not yet been able to master in my irises on the right. In these kinds of images, the direct contact between plant and the resulting photograph sidesteps many complex arguments around artistic intervention. Cyanotypes show nature as something that can be paused, aestheticized, and preserved to be studied. This potentially infinite preservation had high social and environmental costs, as Siobhan Angus has shown. So Atkins and Dixon were deeply enmeshed in multiple scientific networks. Their techniques and formulas likely came from family friend, scientist, and neighbor Sir John Herschel. Photographs of British algae uses the most recent and then unpublished Latin naming practices. Several of the fern cyanotypes also bear Latin names invented in the 1840s. Atkins importantly grew up in a scientific family, which she emphasized in her 1853 book, The Memoir of J.G. Children, Esquire. So after her father's death, and while she's working on the fern cyanotypes, Anna synthesizes and fills gaps in family archival materials that her father left behind to represent both her father, herself, and their family. The memoir switches tense and voice frequently. Many poems and footnotes are signed AA, and it is her only typeset book. Its existence and its form suggest her interest in obliquely articulating her identity during the period she photographs the ferns. Atkins is and was a continually present author who tried to efface her presence. So importantly, among other things, the memoir highlights the family's friendship with Georges Cuvier, and Cuvier was a French naturalist whose theories contributed to scientific racism. So Atkins directly profits from Cuvier's theories. She experimented with photography and advanced her own curiosity by marrying money that originally came from first enslaving and then underpaying people of African descent. I don't have any images to go with this genealogical slide, I'm afraid. So the Atkins family were absentee owners of at least 4 plantations and absentee mortgage holders of another 3 plantations in Jamaica. And like many of their peers, they actively fought the British government's offer of compensation during emancipation in 1833 to 38. So they're really very pro-plantation. After emancipation in 1838, the Atkins family continued to use their Jamaican land as coffee plantations, much like the still active Creighton coffee farm shown here. At death, their estate included, quote, property at Doddinghurst, at Rotherhithe, in the City of London, and at Port Royal, Jamaica. Atkins was also not shy about publishing overt, if complicated, ties to the British Empire through deceased family members. In the memoir I mentioned a few moments ago, she emphasizes how her mother, Hester Holwell, was, quote, the granddaughter of Governor Holwell, who in 1756 endured and survived the dreadful night in the too celebrated Black Hole of Calcutta. The governor could never bear to recall the horrors of that fearful time. He was a wonderful old man, and in spite of the trials he had gone through, lived to the age of 98. Nevertheless, the governor still managed to publish several accounts of the Black Hole, which was a complex encounter between the Mughal Empire and the East India Company that became a rallying point for expanding British presence in India. Holwell died well before Anna was born, but the emotional language in this and other passages suggests a desire for impossible intergenerational contact. Atkins was determined to publish her family's connections to major past events of British imperial expansion. The memoir joins her finances to draw her close to the expanding British Empire. So once again, I don't have an image to go with Dixon's genealogy, a perpetual struggle of mine. But Dixon also has deep familial relationships with colonialism, as most members of her family served in the military in India, both before and after the British government took control from the company. Like Atkins's memoir, Dixon also worked to publish the scientific findings of deceased relatives, which indicate, for example, that Dixon herself knew Louis Agassiz. And Agassiz was also an infamous scientist who, like Cuvier, circulated extensive white supremacist theories in support of scientific racism. So neither Atkins nor Dixon write explicitly in support of colonialism, in support of the British Empire, but also neither of them bother to edit or revise their links with the same power structures or a tacit approval in typeset form. The Henry Dixon who received the Fern photographs began his career in the British East India Company's Madras Infantry, and he dies a colonel shortly after the Sepoy Rebellion. He was also a photographer who traveled between India and Europe to exhibit these and other photographs. Given his interest in colonial photography and his status as active agent of the British Empire, it makes sense that he received 2 volumes of cyanotypes from his aunt and her friend in 1853 and in 1861, dates that marked military promotions for him. 2 volumes of Fern cyanotypes, made by artists financially, socially, intellectually, and familiarly ensnared in colonialism, were destined for an agent of the actual boots-on-the-ground process of British empire building and maintenance. So these albums represent and spatialize in miniature the political processes that Colonel Dixon enacted as a member of the military. That all 4 Fern albums were presentation gifts offers a reminder of the troubling ways that imperial expansion was something to celebrate in Victorian Britain. In their compositional sparseness, however, these Fern images eschew traditional tropes of landscapes. Their compositions are, however, deliberate. They also represent a specific space through the artist's naming strategy, and they fundamentally make space within the picture plane. Atkins and Dixon frequently made multiple images of the same species, shown here, and even though these individual species do not repeat within a given volume. For example, Polypodium thagopteris, which they photographed at least 3 times. Comparing versions suggests an underlying aesthetic logic that wrestled with scale. The images together also reveal the extraordinary intentionality behind these artworks. They had to not only select a frond, but also potentially prune, or bend it, to fit it into the page, and then are they going to remove damaged parts? Are they going to keep roots? Having selected and shaped the plant, the artists had to then choose where it belonged on the page and how many fronds would join it. Did it need a Latin name and a place? You cannot correct any mistakes in cyanotype, and any hesitancy will leave a trace. You quite literally have less than a second to make your image. So within these supposedly simple artworks, there's actually an awful lot of choices at play. Many prints add a label, in this case, the word British written in script and appended below the Latin name. The addition ensured the plant had an origin, with a textual specificity far greater than reality. The species is actually found throughout vast swaths of North America, Europe, and Asia, not just the British Isles or even the former British Empire. So the act and placement of the titles further entangled the artworks with colonialism by ensuring each image was fixed to a physical place. In many ways, I think this is similar to how 18th century vues d'optique transform a country or a culture into a single image for a distant viewer's pleasure. In this case, the view is of Vietnam. In the cyanotypes, the botanical Latin labels followed the nomenclature formalized by Carl Linnaeus as a means of assimilating global plants into European academic knowledge systems, again like the engravings. These were part of a much larger and longer European interest in botany and bioprospecting as a sort of shadow colonialism. Many ferns in Atkins and Dixon's photographs have contemporary place names, like British or Jamaican. And in fact, many ferns have just simply a place name and no species. The naming act equates the plant specimen with geopolitical reality, again, like the vue d'optique. Thus, it's important that Atkins and Dixon describe at least 25 ferns within Henry Dixon's volume as Jamaican. I've cross-referenced the origins of these 25 ferns, some of which are shown here. The results of this analysis indicate broadly tropical distribution for the majority of species that Atkins and Dixon link to just one island. This discrepancy could arise from artistic intention, accident, forgetfulness, or incorrect knowledge in good faith. So I don't want to make too much of it. But regardless of the cause, the effect indicates a flexible and expansive definition of Jamaica that continually ties the images, or 25% of the volume, to an imagined geography. Following a pattern documented by Jill Cassid, white people brought plants from around the globe to the Caribbean for ornament and agriculture. They then naturalized their presence in history and in art to naturalize the plantation. Atkins and Dixon did something similar when they condensed a large swath of the tropical world into one Caribbean island, the island that also funded the images. In dedicating a quarter of one book to supposedly Jamaican ferns, Atkins directed attention toward the financial origins of her multi-decade experiments with cyanotypes. At the same time, Dixon intended this book for an East India Company captain and later Royal British Colonel in India. The bound volume materializes the proximate multi-directional exchanges of Victorian colonialism. The intellectual and social underpinnings of this project reverberate through its formal strategies. In the fern prints, the geographical label is uniformly pushed toward the bottom, evoking the ground. In the Getty print of Polypodium fagopterus, the label even rubs against the central rib of the fern, drawing a further parallel with the process of growing. Despite the possibilities that Linnaeus's binomial nomenclature offers of a name disassociated from the plant, the artists draw the two together. Atkins and Dixon thus present dynamic waves emanating from Latin names and English places, suggesting how the text begets the fern, which begets the image, and linking the fronge to the place. Horizontal leads to vertical and thus creates a form of depth. Everything in the cyanotype enforces this relationship between lone perfect specimen and scientific label. These two elements create and delineate the environment within the image, swirling around pristine voids. The circumstances of its creation are control across a frightening number of registers. So all of the ferns in their sparseness affect multiple elisions of greenhouses, of fern gatherers, of ships, of sailors, of miners, of farmers, the list goes on. Multiple absences are intrinsic to the resulting photographs, thus. Atkins and Dixon wanted to make them exist within a space that seems empty. But the elision assumes new meaning for Jamaican ferns, given the long history of artistically alighting labor in British representations of the island. Atkins's Adiatum cerulatum perhaps came from a specimen shipped to Britain from one of her family's plantations. It is the only species to be found exclusively in Jamaica. Curving gracefully across the page, the fern sways slightly on its way into the corner. Formally, it looks quite like a palm frond against a deep blue sea, the ultimate plant allegory of the tropics. Throughout the Caribbean region, palm trees were hybrid botanical architecture that marked important public spaces and also the boundaries of plantations. The scale of the resulting fern cyanotype condenses a towering tropical plant into something easily touched and held. Fern and palm fronds obviously resemble each other, but I think this resemblance assumes new meaning within the context I have so far elaborated. So figure and ground are distinct, if barely. The largely vertical ferns join the largely horizontal labels to create height and width. And the fact that the fern exists, it consumes and creates space, and thus time within the picture plane. Though the fore and backgrounds blend, the space is formally and conceptually a landscape, as it is space that the maker tied to a place. Adiantum cerulatum places the fern at the front of the picture plane, literally foregrounding the recessional voided area. Note the botanical manipulation, the naming, and the materiality are designed to seem happenstance, but they're actually the result of careful and extended deliberation. Power is so complete and so uniform that it leaves no apparent trace. Vastness supersedes variety. In many ways, this aesthetic strategy responds to historical reality. Made in the decades following emancipation, when both labor supply and economic trajectory for Jamaica were unclear, the cyanotypes emphasized control over an infinitely vast horizon rather than over bodies. Perhaps the former seemed more achievable. Acknowledging the fern cyanotypes as landscapes returns them to a system of spatializing power and control from which they came. It also acknowledges the white supremacy inherent to their production and preservation, while moving discussions of the plantation and its images beyond body fetishes. As much as plantation imagery relies on bodies, as much as the plantation itself relies on bodies, they also produce space. Expanding the definition of plantation landscapes to include these images risks suggesting that there is nothing but violence and oppression everywhere. In turn, this also risks occluding historical joy and survivance. So I would really love for there to be a definitive narrative of resistance within these fern cyanotypes. But I've yet to find one after years of looking and thinking. I think the images are so severely minimal and so severely totalizing that I don't know if there's room for anything else beyond this serene control. So in conclusion, I wish to reiterate that while this paper draws on multiple kinds of evidence to build a case, I don't mean for this to be merely a wholesale indictment. Rather, I would like for this to be a provocation to examine how genealogy, history, provenance, and finance create entangled webs of meaning through art, especially for makers without large archives. Rather than concluding on a blanket condemnation, which is not my intention, I would like to emphasize the theoretical ramifications of what I've just shared. Namely, what actually are the spatial, financial, aesthetic, and conceptual boundaries of the plantation? How might these multiple boundaries exist within one object? How and where was the plantation aestheticized? Thank you.
Nicola, did you have a question?
I realized I don't really have a question. I just wanted to thank you because I love the talk. As Irene says, I think it's wonderful to incorporate these kind of images into a wider context of art history. I mean, I was particularly taken with Emily's images of the Walter Crane books because I, for a long time, collected children's illustrated books and have loved Walter Crane's illustrations so much. And I didn't know about his kind of socialist projects, so I was really fascinated. I'm going to go back and look at some of them. But I also loved the images that Joseph showed us, and I'm just, my only comment is I wonder if gender also plays into those.
So can you hear the question or the comments, Joseph? Yeah.
And I wondered if gender also is a way, I think in your summary at the end, you were talking about all the different discourses that you felt, you know, of power. But I thought maybe this was one way that women could say something to those discourses in a way, a bit like watercolors, or you know, those kind of small sketchbooks that women produce. So anyway, just
Do you think that their gender plays a role in these images, Joseph?
Yes, I think in some ways gender is definitely wrapped up in what's happening in Anna Atkins and Anne Dixon's project, to the extent that, well, why wouldn't gender always be wrapped up in sort of as part of one's identity? Why wouldn't it be wrapped up in what they're doing? I think in that moment there is also a really interesting way, and I like the watercolor comparison in that, do the cyanotypes enable her to say something that she just couldn't or wouldn't say in so many words? What's interesting about Anna Atkins, right, is that even though she's now sort of this famous photographer, most of her letters that I've read actually don't really mention anything about photographs. For example, the Royal Society has like 50 letters between her and John Herschel where they just simply talk about potatoes. That's it, just potatoes. So I do like the idea of gender. And I think there's also a growing body of scholarship that shows that there are also women plantation owners, there are women enslavers, and there are women absentee plantation owners as well. And that sort of discourse is a bit different in British gender relations than it is, say, if a man is in the same position. So that's something that I'm definitely sitting with and thinking about, but I don't know that I have anything more like clear to say at the moment. But thank you.
I'm muted, okay. Emily, could you say a little, you talked about this tension with the market in Crane's work because of his political views and how these illustrations were a sort of subtle way. What was the commercial success of this book? I mean, was it, or do you know, was it?
This was actually one of his most successful books, outside of like the translations of fairy tales that he did. So the Mrs. Mundy one that I showed from the 1875 was kind of his first foray into trying to pen and picture a fairy tale himself that was connected to like one of the continental fairy tales that they were now translating and anglicizing. And it didn't do well like at all. And then he kind of moved into, there was like a huge kind of Grimm's fairy tale boom at the end of the 70s and the 80s. And then the kind of French interpretations. And so he was very focused on that. And then around this time, after he was like, I'm a socialist, he started doing this. And this one was very successful. The second one was successful. And then when he got very overtly socialist in the third one, they started to decline in popularity. And then he moved a little bit more into painting and watercolors. But yeah, so this one was very successful. It had multiple print runs. It was listed for into like, I think it was 1893 is one of Castle's like top gift books for like each year. So it had, so it came out, I think it had about 5 republishings in the first like 3 years around that. So
and the very sort of subtle political commentary only occurs in that one sort of.
No, they're in all. Yeah, so it's kind of classified. So like the Forest Feast has a bit more empirical critique. The second one of Queen Summer is, which I wrote my master's on, is more of like the debate between arts and crafts in the empire at the time. The third one is fully socialist and how this Countess became a socialist, and everyone's like, this is ridiculous. The fourth one, basically was banker came and basically married like the heir of this fantastical garden, and everyone's like, absolutely not. And then the fifth one was on literature and like history. So yeah, once it became a little less anthropomorphized and more like become more costumes than actual floral anthropomorphized creatures, they become a little less popular in his other
but within this particular book that you showed us, this is the most, the image that has carries political overtones.
The next one would be like the tiger lilies, and they're very whitewashed. And then there's some from like lilies from South Africa that he basically made it very childish. So there's a bit more, but this is the most like direct.
Right. Yes.
I also have a question for Emily. Fascinating material. Thank you so much for sharing. This is an annoying comment by every modernist. So I couldn't help myself. Of course, the Botticelli's Primavera, given the title of the series Flora, and also that the first image of the series is clearly based on flora, formally speaking.
And I was wondering, given that in the 1880s, the field of art history was still very much information, if we can read this series almost like socialist art history of la lettre, given also other citations like the Knight was clearly copied from, let's say, 16th century Germanic depictions of knights. Do you have, like, what do you make out of this historicizing citations in Crane's work of major works that made up the canons in the 19th century?
I don't think I have time to fully answer your question. Because he was studying a lot of this, and in the 6 or 87, he'd gone to Italy like previously to work on this, and then he goes back to Italy a few years later while he's working on one of the other books. So he's very much aware of this, and he's also in his larger like socialist paintings, he's reinterpreting particularly Greek myths into like the socialist iconography and into that message as well. So there's a lot that he's doing with this, and he's a big studier of this, and that's a big part of the component. And the idea of like spring and like flora becomes his like personal fascination, and it's connected to socialism. And he specifically studies different myths from different countries about the allegory of spring and like flora, and how they're kind of different across Europe and how to incorporate them. So yeah, it's very significant, and I think he's doing a lot of this work. He just doesn't talk about it as much as the other one. And so, yeah, we could go into a lot of these examples.
Yeah. Yes, hi, I have a question for Vivian. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more. I was especially interested of what you're saying about there are different variations of paper that the artists were drawing on for the export market. And I was wondering if there was anything within the letters that sort of explain why they weren't sort of being made on Chinese paper, which I would expedite the process rather than waiting for the paper to come from either the Netherlands, or because it seemed like what you said was that the Dutch paper was sent by the Dutch and then sent back, and then the British paper was sent by the British commissioners. Was it something just because of the quality? Why was that sort of impacted?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because in the realm of export paintings made in China, majority of them were actually done in Chinese paper. But it is quite interesting and quite, and that's why I think they are a very special group, that they are very rarely kind of like just done on English paper predominantly and other European papers. And my speculation is that like because the British papers are a lot thicker, and so like compared to normal Chinese papers. And I think because they were instructed to make certain botanical depictions with a certain sort of likeness to the actual plant, and it requires a lot more shading than usual Chinese painting, which is a little bit flatter. And so I think like the use of British paper could be, for a practical reason, could be the thickness of the paper that allows for more kind of workmanship on the actual medium. But it could, I think, like speculating this too, because there isn't much information on that, but I think there could be also another possibility, is that because these were specially commissioned for a scientific interest, and so perhaps they were looking to kind of compile them together as they would, but you know, it seems that the system totally collapsed when these paintings came back, and then everything was kind of detached from their original binding. But I wondered whether it could do with the original commissioning and the kind of like the objective of commissioning these and to standardize these for a certain kind of study process. So yeah, this is something that I would need to go further into.
So welcome back, everyone. Sorry about the kind of ongoing technical issues. I think hopefully we've resolved them. For our third session, we have Linda up first. Linda is a postdoctorate researcher at the University of Zurich. She'll be presenting the paper, Drawing the Contract, Visualizing Obligation in the Early Modern Mediterranean and Atlantic World. Her area of research specializes in Italy and its Mediterranean and transatlantic connections through the Spanish Empire. She will receive her, or you have received your PhD in art history and architecture from Harvard University in May this year, with a dissertation on the media history of artistic and architectural drawings within legal and jurisdictional contexts in the early modern era, in early modern Italy, Spain, and the Spanish Americas. Beginning in September, Linda joined the Biblioteca Hertziana and in Rome as a postdoctoral fellow.
Yeah, so I'm in Zurich.
In Zurich. And she is currently working on her first booked manuscript, a revision of her dissertation titled Drawings and the Law in Early Modern Europe.
Thank you very much. But before I want to thank the Colnaghi and Athena Art Foundations, their staff for organizing this exciting symposium. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak today. In Southern Europe, drawings were appended to notarized public contracts as early as the mid-14th century. These drawings anticipated the aesthetic outcome of artistic and architectural commissions and showcased the technical skill of the draftsman. They also aided in calculating material costs and labor divisions. Kept with the written contract in notarial archives to ensure their legal enforceability and evidentiary weight, they functioned as visual securities intended to mitigate future disputes over commissions. On an ethical level, they gave tangible form to trust, obligation, and reliability. Legal principles central to Roman contract law, such as equitas, equity, consensus, consent, and especially bona fides, good faith, were regularly evoked in these written contracts, often in the very same clause that referred to the attached drawing, binding the visual closely to the verbal. Just as artistic drawing practices and art theory underwent significant transformations in the 16th and 17th centuries, so too did contract law and contract theory. In territories tied to the Spanish Empire, these shifts were propelled by Mediterranean expansion, the conquest of the Americas, and establishment of the viceroyalties. Atlantic maritime trade, and with it, the escalating risks of long-distance sea transportation. Ethical concerns emerged about the moral implications of conquest, resource extraction, and the trade with indigenous peoples in the Americas. Legal thinkers of the School of Salamanca began to interrogate what principles such as bona fides, equitas, and consensus ought to signify within the evolving imperial frameworks of the Spanish Empire. These debates also shaped contractual relationships in the building, artisanal, and artistic realms, as they raised the core question of contracting itself. Who had the right to sign a contract and potentially its attached drawing, as was common practice, as shown in the example on the slide, within a colonial society marked by a wide range of social statuses, languages, levels of literacy, and conditions of freedom and unfreedom under enforced colonial law. For contract drawings, then, the question arises, to what extent the transregional and transcultural dimensions of contract making were negotiated through them, especially in the administrative centers of the Spanish Americas and in major trade hubs such as Seville, Genoa, or Barcelona, where this contract, for instance, was drawn up. How did these drawings mediate artistic, legal, and imperial contact and conquest across the early Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds? And equally important, what were the limits of such drawings as agents of cultural exchange within these contractual landscapes? In pursuing these questions in my paper today, I will first speak about a few selected cases of visual contracting in the Spanish Mediterranean, then turn to the transatlantic contracting, and finally touch on the limits of visual contracting. Within the Mediterranean, the early modern Spanish Empire extended, as many of you will know, from the Iberian Peninsula to Italian territories under direct Spanish rule, such as Sicily, Sardinia, Milan, and Naples. Beyond this administered territories,
Spain maintained a strong economic and political relationships with maritime powers such as Genoa, which invested financially in Spain's imperial and military endeavors, an alliance that has been characterized by historians as symbiotic imperialism. Art and architecture were among the tools of these arrangements. The Spanish court became a hub of Genoese craftsmanship, with Genoese artists and architects actively shaping the cultural projects of Habsburg Spain. A telling example of how these alliances played out in visual contracting is a refined contract drawing by the Genoese sculptor Giuseppe Carlone. In 1612, Carlone was commissioned by the Spanish ambassador to Genoa, Juan Vivas de Cañamas, to produce a statue of the Duke of Lerma, a statesman, cardinal, and favorite of Philip III. Likely financed through the Duke of Tuscany, the large marble statue portraying the Duke of Lerma as a knight with his political insignia was intended for his family palace in the coastal city of Denia between Alicante and Valencia. The contract was finalized in Genoa at the residence of the banker and diplomat Filippo Adorno, an active figure in Spanish financial affairs. Once completed, the statue was shipped across the Mediterranean to its destination. And while now lost, the contract drawing survives in the Genoese notarial archives. Genoa itself maintained an extensive network of colonies throughout the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The Genoese government and the Bank of St. George commissioned public works of political significance for installation in their colonies, formalized through contracts, and that often also included drawings. Take, for example, this contract drawing by the sculptor Matteo Civitali for a column with St. George, commissioned by the Bank of St. George to be erected in the newly annexed city of Sarzana. Or this large crest of the Republic of Genoa, here on the right side, to be produced in the city, shipped and installed in Bastia on Corsica, which then was administered as a Genoese colony. To this day, surviving in the notarial archives, these contract drawings are related to a paradox central to imperial projects: the use of contractual law to legitimize and consolidate control over territories whose occupation may lack legal or moral legitimacy. By deploying the legal apparatus of contracts, imperial powers compensated for the contested foundations of their authority. The contracts not only bound artists to their projects, but also served as assertions of imperial governance, transforming contested occupations into domains of lawful enterprise and cultural, artistic, and material domination. And while the commissioned works were shipped and installed in distant locations, the drawn blueprints remained behind, serving as a permanent testament to Genoa's control and possessions. However, not all works visualized in contract drawings bore political imagery. A group of drawings commissioned by Genoese stonemasons and sculptors for export to Spain are notably simple in design. These include marble balustrades and columns for residences of the Spanish viceroys in Sicily, chimneys and portals for Simancas and Seville, as well as doors, window frames, and a portal for the palace of the ambassador to Genoa to be shipped to Valencia. These designs were often of the Serlian type found in architectural prints in Sebastiano Serlio's widely disseminated Trattato de Arquitectura. Yet, patrons preferred contract drawings over citing printed models, suggesting that drawings carried different kind of authority. The form of the drawing, unique, executed by the master's hand, inscribed into a contract and signed, mattered as much as its content. Even when conventional in design, attaching a drawing to a contract transformed it into an instrument of obligation. Beyond the export of works of art, contract drawings also responded to the import of materials circulating through Mediterranean trade networks. Around 1600, for instance, the influx of diverse stones for chapels, tombs, altarpieces, and other architectural projects prompted a marked increase in the use of color and wash in Genoese contract drawings, which serve to differentiate specific local and imported stone types, sometimes as many as 10, as Roberto Santamaria's research on marble trade in Genoa has shown. This practice underscored the evolving role of contract drawings as both technical documents and visual tools for pricing and quality control in an increasing globalized marketplace. These different ways in which transregional alliances in the Mediterranean echo in contract drawings show how notarized contracts operated as instruments of political and imperial strategy, facilitating the material realization of shared ambitions and reinforcing alliances and cultural cohesion across geographic divides. These drawings contributed to the creation of a narrative of unity expressed through common visuality, material property, and shared access to artistic labor. Signing these contracts and approving of contract drawings was a repeated practice of reassurance and visualization of good faith practices between these powers and their artistic and legal agents. A similar but more complex dynamics can be observed in the Spanish Atlantic. Many art commissions intended for export to the Spanish Americas from Spain were managed by colonial subjects returning from the viceroyalties to the Iberian Peninsula, entrusted with securing works and overseeing commissions. Jesus Palomero Paramo has recently published a contract drawing that relates to transatlantic contracting. It involved Gil Vasquez, a Sevillian emigrant who sought prosperity and social advancement in the Americas. Vasquez traveled to the New Kingdom of Granada in 1567 as part of a missionary expedition of Dominicans sent to evangelize the province of San Antonio. Eventually disassociating himself from the order, Vasquez settled in Tunja, a city on the eastern ranges of the Colombian Andes, northeast from Bogota, and became a businessman. In the fall of 1583, he returned to Seville with a list of entrusted commissions worth over 15,000 pesos. Among the commissions was a request from the City Council of Tunja for a processional monstrance for the celebration of Corpus Christi. For the commission, Vasquez turned to the sculptor Juan Bautista Vasquez de Ilder. The contract, signed in October 1583, stipulated that the monstrance be shipped on the fleet, then in preparation to ensure its timely arrival in the Americas. Attached to the contract was a drawing, filed as its cover page by the notary. The Eucharistic tower, measuring over 1 meter, was to be crafted from wood and divided into 3 sections. It was to be assembled with screws, fitted with glass panels, and fully gilded, including the figures. The contract also detailed the method of delivery. The monstrance was to be dismantled, packed in crates, and limited to a set weight to allow transportation by canoe. The completed work was shipped from Seville on the 1584 gallons, which reached Cartagena in February 1585, and from there began a 6-week journey by canoe and overland path to Tunja. Drawings could also be sent across the Atlantic for works commissioned in Spain. In a contract drawn up in Seville in 1607 between Francisco Galeano, a resident of Lima, and Juan Martinez Montañez, one of Seville's most successful sculptors, a drawing is mentioned. Montañez was to produce the sculptures for a large altarpiece dedicated to Saint John the Baptist, and intended for the monastery of the Conception in Lima, according to a drawing sent from Lima. The drawing was executed in Lima by Diego López Bueno and intended to guide Montañez's work, but also secure a smooth assembling of the different pieces on site. Between 1608 and 1622, the sculptures were completed, paid for, and shipped in installments. And in this case, it is the altarpiece that has survived, while the drawing mentioned in the contract has been lost. Like in Genoa, the trade and extraction of materials resurface also in Spanish contract drawings. A case in point is the chapel endowed by the jurist and inquisitor Gaetan, who served in the Andes during his career. The chapel, to be built in his native town of Tordesillas, was financed with wealth accumulated in the viceroyalties. When the architect Lonzano was commissioned to construct it in 1668, subsequent lawsuits produced 9 drawings, many of them contract drawings that were submitted as evidence. These documents provide insights not only into the financing of the project, but also into the specific materials intended for its embellishment. They suggest that elements such as gilding, indicated here in yellow wash, and silver ornamentation were likely tied to transatlantic extraction. While the drawings negotiated terms, costs, and workmanship, the gold and silver that underpinned the commission, and in some cases constituted the very materials used, here mediated through wash, potentially derived from colonial systems of labor in the Americas. Beyond import-export dynamics, the contract drawing itself, as an instrument of obligation, functioned as a colonial export to the legal systems of the viceroyalties. In New Spain, for example, works were often commissioned through drawings in a European style, particularly in ecclesiastical contexts. Contract drawings became an established legal and artistic practice for both artists born and trained in Spain, working overseas, and those trained locally. One example is this contract drawing by the sculptor Francisco della Gándara. In 1626, the convent of San Jose in Puebla commissioned the sculptor to build and gild a large altarpiece. Although the artist and his collaborators fulfilled the commission, they were never paid, which led to a lawsuit in 1638. During this lawsuit, the commissioner's lawyer presented a forged certificate claiming the work had been settled, but the artist contested it as false. To prove the forgery, the sculptor's lawyer submitted the signed contract drawing as evidence that you see here on the screen, using the signatures for comparison. And indeed, the court ruled in the artist's favor. This remarkable rare case demonstrates the strong evidentiary value of contract drawings in colonial settings. The drawing with its signatures carried more weight than both a written signed certificate and oral witness testimony. These are just few examples that show how European contract drawings mattered in transatlantic settings and became embedded in Spanish colonial legal systems. Yet they also raise further questions. How did non-European visual and pictorial traditions intersect with these practices? Did pictorial writing, for instance, play a role in contracting between indigenous groups and colonial subjects in the Americas? An intriguing case of mislabeling of a pictographic legal document from 1554 helps to frame these questions. It was drawn up in the southern part of the basin of Mexico in present-day Mexico City and is now preserved at the French National Library in Paris. Written in both Nahuatl and Spanish, the document records the town of Huitzilopochtli's commitment to pay tribute to Bernardino Vázquez de Tapia, whom they recognized as the encomendiero. The tribute is visualized through pictographs, 100 measures of maize and 50 coins, reales per year, also with 1 turkey or chicken, 2 bundles of firewood, and 2 loads of grass daily. The canoe depicts how the people of Huitzilopochtli intended to transport the tribute to Mexico City and to the encomendiero's residence. When this document entered the National Library in Paris, it was labeled as, I cite, Contrato de Encomienda, so encomienda contract. Soon after, however, scholars such as José María Ots Capdeki challenged this classification, emphasizing that encomiendas were never created through contracts, but were instead granted through royal concessions. The encomienda system transferred indigenous labor and tribute rights to Spaniards as a royal favor. Royal decrees throughout the 16th century confirmed that tribute amounts were fixed by colonial authorities and not freely negotiated. Legal scholars of the School of Salamanca, including Francisco de Vitoria, Domingo de Soto, and Luis de Molina, criticized precisely this absence of contractual relationships in colonial governance. Their concerns went beyond the lack of formal contracts, highlighting the unjust nature of Spanish colonial rule, which they argue violated natural rights and consent. The manuscript in Paris, therefore, does not record the creation of an encomienda, but rather the result of a legal dispute. It represents a formal official recording of ruling, documenting the tributes that the indigenous signatories were required to pay their encomiendiero in accordance with the decision of the colonial high court. Because the encomienda was a royal concession rather than a contract, the term encomienda contract is a misnomer. This distinction helps explain why pictographs are typically absent from contracts proper under colonial law, including contracts for works of art. Pictographs did, however, play a significant role in other legal records of tribute payments and obligations of service, such as tribute registers, cartas de pago, receipts, and payrolls. These documents were also used in lawsuits and often accepted by judges as evidence and litigation exhibits. The famous it's already late. Huejotzingo Codex, created by an anonymous artist from the Huejotzingo community, illustrates this practice, recording the tributes provided by the town to members of the High Court of Mexico City, including an image of the Madonna. It was submitted in a famous lawsuit brought by Hernando Cortés in Mexico City against the administration of the very High Court in 1531. Like the Cartas de Pago, and as art historians such as Tom Cummins have discussed, the sheet of the Huejotzingo Codex visually documented material goods and labor already rendered. To conclude, what I have sought to demonstrate is that contract drawings were not merely technical addenda, but active participants in imperial economies, legal systems, and artistic production. Through physically often immobile, they enabled mobility across empires by binding distant parties into shared legal and cultural frameworks. As administrative instruments and as micro-art histories, they reveal the expansive reach of imperial power. At the same time, they were created by only a few historical actors. Many, such as enslaved laborers, often indigenous workers, and also woman makers, were systematically excluded from contracting and by extension from visual contracting practices. As in much archival and art historical work, absence proves as telling as the traces that survive. Thank you.
So Gonzalo Munofera is an assistant professor in the School of Architecture at Virginia Tech and a PhD candidate at McGill University School of Architecture. Since 2005, he has studied influence of images as a globalizing tool for shaping cultures and cities through aesthetics and appearances. His doctoral research studies the role of visuals in the construct of cities and cultures in the 19th century, Western visuality, installing the foundations of the current theme convention. He's previously taught in architecture schools in Chile, Colombia, and Canada. Thank you, Gonzalo.
Thank you for the introduction. Can you see my screen? Okay, and there's no echo. The audio is okay. All right, thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor to present this research at the Athena Art Foundation and the Colnaghi Foundations as well. Thank you for allowing me to present this also online. The title of my presentation is Rediscovering Latin America, Robert Burford's Panorama of Lima, 1834, and through the eyes of Lieutenant William Smith. So panoramas were invented by Irish portrait painter Robert Barker in 1787 when he produced a 360-degree picture of Edinburgh from the top of the Calton Hill. Panoramas were popular art and entertainment exhibitions whose venues populated most of the major European capitals, particularly London and Paris during the 19th century. The first ever built rotunda, the one that we're seeing in the slide, was located actually in the Leicester Square in London and designed by architect Robert Mitchell. Panoramas display various picture themes, including biblical accounts, current war episodes, landscapes, cityscapes from around the world, and even historical events such as public appearances. Before the advent of photography and cinema, panoramas attracted a multitude of spectators, mainly because no specific background knowledge was required to appreciate the artworks, and also because they were affordable compared to the other art and entertainment venues. Panoramas also convey a particular sense of reality due to the lifelike and remarkably detailed images presented on canvas. It was like a window to the world around. The extent of these artworks and the immersive experience demanded a specific kind of architecture, the panorama rotundas. The rotunda in the Leicester Square, the one that we're looking at the slide, had a diameter of 30 meters, and the wall from floor to ceiling was of 20 meters. And the Leicester Square Rotunda was located in the entertainment district of London and consisted of a main entrance on the north side of the square, through which visitors entered a narrow corridor and walked 70 feet towards the central platform. This situation led visitors to enter an unseen building, unable to understand its dimensions and shape, creating an even more extraneous feeling when facing the frameless canvas inside. In 1824, English artist and entrepreneur Robert Burford acquired the Panorama Leicester Square Rotunda after the former owners retired from business. From then onwards, this venue showcased the most exotic and unexpected cities worldwide, in addition to the main European cities. However, most of these city representations were made on-site by other travelers instead of Robert Burford, particularly travelers related to the several journeys to the British colonies worldwide. The only original material from almost a century of yearly panorama productions is preserved in the booklets produced and printed for each exhibition, which reunite written descriptions and miniature panorama sketches of the cities on display. Panorama programs guided the gaze of those who acquired these ephemera as a cicerone for comprehending visually and historically what their eyes faced. These prints provided valuable and didactic assistance to curious and inexperienced visitors, particularly those interested in the exotic cities depicted on canvas. Likewise, programs objectified a subjective approach to reading these panoramas before the emergence and consolidation of guidebooks for travelers or any standard museum catalog. On the Lima program front page, the one that we're looking at the screen now on the slide, Burford announced that the panorama was based on drawings produced by Lieutenant William Smith in Peru in 1834. 2 years later, the exhibition, exclusively dedicated to Lima, shed public light on the capital of this country, taken from a private house observatory. Having the panorama canvases and rotunda extinct, the only primary sources available are the panorama programs. These prints consisted of a 16-page octavo book format with a folded page that included a miniature key of the panorama on display. As usual in Burford's era, he structured Lima's program content in 3 sequential parts: historical, descriptive, and visual. Considered the first public representation of the former Spain's viceroyalty capital in Europe, Burford's panorama relied on someone else's eyes in order to exhibit the 360-degree panorama of what was known as, quote, the city of the kings, end quote. In 1834, while circumnavigating Latin America, British Lieutenant William Smith surveyed Lima from the top of a private observatory house, unveiling an unprecedented image to the European public. Smith's sketches were fundamental in producing the first panorama of Lima, which was displayed at Burford's Leicester Square Panorama, thereby reaching a broader audience due to the popularity and affordability of this venue. Born in London in the 1800s, William Smith arrived in Lima, Peru, as the lieutenant of the HMS Samarang, which was commanded by Captain Charles Henry Paget. In 1836, he published, together with Frederick Lowe, a narrative of a journey from Lima to Para, recounting an 8-month journey across the Andes and down the Amazon to the Atlantic coast of Brazil. The reason of this mission, which is presented in this book that we're looking at the screen, are stated at the beginning of this book. Quote, in the month of June 1834, His Majesty's ship Samarang, Captain T.H. Paget, arrived at Callao and remained stationary there for 3 months previous to her final departure for England, the time of service being expired. During her stay, I visited the interesting city of Lima as often as the duties of the ship would permit, where I was most hospitably entertained by our Consul General B. Wilson, to whose kindness both myself and my companion are deeply indebted, end quote. Having Smith's panorama of Lima and his description shared in Burford's panorama of Lima's program, my analysis proposes to compare and contrast the graphic and written information contained in this booklet with the material from periodicals and illustrations circulating and available at the time. The content analysis dissects this panorama program according to its narrative structure: historical, on the history of the city displayed; descriptive, on the information of the selected landmarks; and visual, on the 2 horizontal panorama plates. By the way, these are the 2 panorama plates that people found in these programs when they acquire these booklets. Early representations of Lima of private or exclusive access date back to the 15th and 16th centuries, such as the one that we're looking at on the screen, the first New Chronicle and Good Government, which was finished around 1615. Its author, the indigenous Peruvian Felipe Guamán Polla de Ayala, sent it as a handwritten manuscript to King Philip III of Spain. His purpose was to provide a historical account of the Andes, from the earliest human inhabitants to the Incas and the Spanish conquest. It was also intended as a call to attention to the deep problems caused by the Spanish government in the region. In the illustration on the screen, we can see that Lima was already referred to as, quote, the city of the kings, la ciudad de los reyes. Also, Dutch publisher Isaac de Rions, in his plan of Lima circa 1760, represents another example of the European interest in the region, particularly in mapping and surveying the land. German painter Johann Moritz Rugendas and his South American artwork exemplified the growing interest in Latin America in the 19th century. He was inspired to paint Central and South America by Alexander von Humboldt. He was hired as an illustrator by Baron von Langsdorff and accompanied him on expeditions in Brazil and then subsequently to Mexico, Peru, and Chile. Here on the screen, we can see his study for Lima's main square, circa 1843. The interest in this country, in Peru, particularly after obtaining independence from the Spanish crown in 1821, also reflects the influx of North Americans to the Latin American region, such as photographer Bill Roy Richardson. probably taken from another private house observatory, similar to the spot that Lieutenant William Smith chose for his panorama of Lima. Richardson also captured the Plaza de Armas and Cathedral of Lima around the 1870s. In the slide, we can compare the northeast view in Smith's panorama on your right-hand side and the southeast angle in Richardson's albumen print on your left-hand side. A more similar angle regarding Richardson's print is the lithograph published in The Mirror, the newspaper The Mirror from April 23rd, 1836, which referred to Burford's panorama of Lima displayed in the Leicester Square Rotunda, but also to an exclusive account of Lima published in this newspaper, probably supplied by Lieutenant Smith. However, the work of American painter Daniel Wadsworth Coit, who was in Lima, Peru in 1826, around 10 years before Lieutenant Smith, represents and provides a closer look at the narrative and visual display produced by Lieutenant Smith of what Londoners and Europeans observed in Burford's Leicester Square panorama in 1836. Similar to the panorama of Mexico, exhibited in the same venue in 1826, Burford adopted a condescending approach based on what, in this case, Lieutenant Smith shared with him towards the country of Peru and its capital, Lima, after a decade of independence. In the program, panorama goers found descriptions such as the following. Quote, "The struggle for freedom, the events of which are too well known to need repetition, was of course detrimental to the prosperity of Lima. The effects of war and the contributions levied by contending armies are everywhere apparent. The convents no longer make the same ostentatious display of the precious metals and jewels, nor are the people so rich and luxurious. But the city is fast recovering. Many new sources of wealth are opened, and should it not be again the scene of war, promises to regain much of its ancient grandeur and be really what is now called, quote unquote, the city of the free, end quote." The adopted narrative tone also maintained an optimistic stance, present almost throughout the booklet, which aligned with the purpose of presenting Lima as a site of opportunities for new economic endeavors for Europeans. Some of these accounts relate to how high classes lived, which also reflects the social group that received Lieutenant Smith in Lima. For example, a description reads, quote, "The interior of the houses of the better class are splendidly furnished, papered, or hung with silk, and ornamented with a profusion of gilding. The bedrooms are particularly costly, with hangings of silk or velvet, marble tables, and silver utensils. The more ordinary have the floors of Dutch tiles, and the walls covered with cloth, painted in various designs." End quote. The description of locals, however, remained harsh, marking a stark contrast between the two societies. For example, in this booklet, panorama goers read, quote, "Limanians are equally addicted to show and extravagance, passionately fond of dress, costly jewels, splendid equipage, and numerous retinues. They are volatile and improvident, much given to dissipation, and cannot be extolled for cleanliness. Smoking is not confined to the male sex. Ladies frequently enjoy the cigar to counteract the effects, as they say, of the heavy use. One of occupation leads to indolence and vice. Consequently, luxury and libertinism have been their characteristics for ages." End quote. In the explanation of the selected landmarks arranged by Burford and based on Lieutenant Smith, the spectators mainly found a positive reaction to the existing architecture, particularly the religious buildings, which were described with great esteem and admiration. In the following slides, I will refer to 3 of these landmarks, illustrating the bounties of the city and its contrast, narrated from a European's perspective. I will complement the unseen experience of these places through the work of American painter Daniel Coit. So in Burford Panorama of Lima program, readers found a description of, in this case, the archway leading to the bridge as follows. A handsome archway of considerable elevation, crowned by turrets, with a clock in the center, leads to the bridge, which is a handsome structure of stone, forming the only communication between the city and the suburb of San Lázaro. It was erected in 1613 by the Viceroy Monteclaros. It has 5 circular arches with piers which project considerably on both sides, to the westward being round, to the eastward pointed, to resist the current, which is here very rapid, from a considerable fall in the river just above, which forms a sort of cascade. The upper part of the bridge is without balustrades, but has a row of stone seats on each side, which in fine weather are filled with fashionable company from 8 until 11 o'clock in the evening. So if we refer to the drawings of Coit in 1826, we finally see the structure in a more clear detail. We can observe a closer look at what Burford, based on Smith, described in his program, but also the limited visual range provided from the vantage point that Smith selected to produce this panorama. On the right-hand side, you have what the spectators might have appreciated when referring to this archway here circling red. In the description of the Rimac River, readers and onlookers found the following, quote, a river of small importance. It rises in the province of Huarochira and receives during its course several small streams produced by the melting of the snow of the Andes or the rains which fall in the interior. In the summer or wet season, the water passes with extreme rapidity. At other times, its bed is nearly dry and can be easily forded at any part. The water, being extremely impure, is seldom used for domestic purposes. End quote. So once spectators found the number landmark on the panorama key here on the right-hand side, and subsequently looked at the panorama canvas displayed in the Leicester Square Rotunda, they envisioned and complemented the idea of the river based on the text. Coyle's drawing on your left here on the screen once more gives us a closer look at what Smith might have experienced while walking by this area. Finally, the account of the Plaza Mayor reads, the great square of Lima is of considerable size and has been the scene of many remarkable events in the history of the city, festivals, executions, processions, etc. It is much frequented at all times for both business and pleasure, and is a scene where the habits and manners so peculiar to the city can be studied. On the eastern side stands the cathedral, Sagrario, and Archbishop's Palace. Near the cathedral are the numerous stalls of the vendors of flowers, nosegays, pucheros, etc. So fond are the ladies of Lima of these beautiful productions of nature that the park has been called, quote, La Calle de Peligro, or the Street of Peril, end quote, which indeed is to those bows who accompany the fair from the enormous price demanded for the rare dowers. On the left is the ancient palace of the viceroys, with a row of open shops called La Libera. On the right, a row of private dwellings erected on the site of the Palace of Pizarro, where he was barbarously assassinated. The whole length of this site is a piazza or colonnade, 10 feet broad, called, quote, Portal de los Botoneros, or button makers. The shops here are principally those of mercers and drapers, and between the pillars are the stalls of the workers in gold and silver lace and buttons. A closer visual approach reveals that both Burford's panorama and Coyle's drawing represent a similar portrayal of this public square, leaving spectators to complete and envision the details not represented in the panorama key. For example, in an account published in the Athenaeum of March 1836, an anonymous reporter referred to, quote, the gorgeous procession entering the cathedral, end quote. In the same article, the reporter described the effect of colors in representing the capital of Peru in this panorama. The account reads, quote, "The coloring of this picture is good and forcible, in parts perhaps a trifle too pretty. As a whole, however, this picture worthily adds another to a series of exhibitions to us always attractive and valuable," end quote. As a conclusion, I identify and propose a set of looking practices that panorama goers applied in front of the panorama of Lima, but also by being present in London, which was considered the center of the world during the 19th century. These two looking practices once coexisted in one single windowless building. These practices are the epicentral look, which situated spectators in London as the center of the world before entering and after exiting the panorama rotunda. This look provided an elevated standpoint on how to interpret visually the images of the world brought to the city. And the condescending look, referring to Lima, in terms of how to interpret otherness through the depiction of the built environment and culture, with European empires always serving as a source of comparison whenever a landmark was brought to the fore in the panorama and its program. This look influenced and allowed Burford to adopt artistic license in what to exclude or hide visually and descriptively based on aesthetics and aligned with European standards from a city he never visited. The systematically excite practices of looking performed before, during, and after spectators' panorama experience in consonance with an enlightened edutainment spirit contributed to an understanding of the reliance on the visual to comprehend the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonzalo. You didn't hear that, but we just gave you a big applause. So we'll ask some questions, but I might go first because I'm right here. I was really interested in how, for both of you, you spoke of this idea of like loss of artwork, whether that's because, you know, an object is ephemeral or through kind of, you know, regions to do with history, or even the sense of loss of the figures or groups of people who wouldn't be excluded from something like a contract. And I'm really interested in how, you know, the role of art is constantly being, I suppose, like codified in terms of like its form and its function and like its aesthetic qualities. And I'm interested in how both of your cases, you have these kind of tangential things that are referring to a work of art that maybe doesn't exist anymore, whether that be the contract or these programs that record like a lost panorama. And I'm interested in, like, have you especially, Linda, have you observed like within those contracts things that you would consider to be like very like aesthetic qualities that maybe, even though the object itself doesn't exist anymore or isn't in the same form, you know, is a form of art?
Shall I go first?
I think you should go first.
This is a wonderful question. Thank you very much for thinking along the lines. Yeah, I think, you know, in my opinion, if we, and that is very much the impetus of the symposium, if we want to extend beyond canonical narratives, we have to somehow, at least that's my mission, to dig into the archives and combine visuals and materials from the archive and more canonical works that are few in museums and are accessible to the public in museum collections. Because I mean, and this is what many have already done in, you know, in the post-colonial approach in a couple of past, like in the last decade or so, to reconstruct narratives or the biographies of objects or the biographies of people that are depicted. It's really important somehow to go back to the archives and try to dig out information about these biographies, maybe object, people, etc. In my case, it's objects, and very often, and although the symposium is related to intermediality, they all relate to, or related in the period they were created, to intermedial dialogue, because of course they foreshadow or they want to foreshadow the final product that the artist was obliged to produce, and that the client wanted to desired and paid for. But most of the time, either you find a citation in the contracts that allude to the drawing lost today, or we still have the drawing. So they were stolen from archives when the archives opened in the 19th century, or were reshuffled to the big national archives. So they got lost, they got stolen. Some of them ended up in museum collections, but the drawings that I showed they all come from archives originally. So even their provenience, those in museum collections, you can then trace them back in my dissertation to specific archives and their original context, how they were filed. So, but even if we have the drawings, almost always then the final product, the broad, like a sculpture or the painting, the altarpiece, the object is lost. So it is it's a puzzling piece, right? It's a puzzle. And as art historians and historians, we have to construct that somehow to tell our narratives about the past. And yeah, I mean, narratives have been excluding, so we need what is left to fill in the gaps, but that's what our field is about, right? It's only very few things have been left, and we construct the history of art, but we constantly have to deal with loss, absence, lacuna, and excluding or exclusivist narratives that we now desire to rethink.
Absolutely, and it constantly changes, those sort of blind spots open up. Gonzalo, I'm interested if you have any thoughts on this, particularly I think that you spoke about how, there are the aesthetic qualities of the records that you still have, but, do you have any thoughts on how the panoramas are really defined by those tangential records?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, in the case of panorama and this construction of the image of the world around, has to do with the public sphere mostly. I don't think these booklets were intended to be like a literary source. They were, in my opinion, intended to be just like an ephemera that lasted only, when the exhibition was on display. But because of the affordability of these prints and how people acquire them, it became a super affordable source of literature. Which, by the way, in London, specifically in England, the literacy rates were getting higher and higher during the 19th century. So people were actually having access to these prints. Beyond the visual, which had to do with the exhibition that lasted for around one year. So there's an after image that probably was recuperated through these prints, to the fact that people could read this afterwards. So there's a construction of an image that was solidified through these public venues. In this case, the panorama. Sometimes they were run. The same panoramas, like in 10 more years, they were showing the same panorama of Mexico in the Leicester Square Rotunda, using the same booklet with little revisions. They crossed the Atlantic as well. They were displayed in America afterwards. The panorama of Peru actually was displayed 4 years after, using the same booklet. So, in my opinion, yeah, the visual and in this case the literature behind these exhibitions, temporary exhibitions, created a particular way of understanding otherness, specifically during the 19th century, specifically when the public museums were information, when these images that I show of Lima and were not shared publicly, they were still in private collections. So the panorama played that role, that public role of making people aware of this is what was happening overseas, and this is how people live, especially in that case the description that were gathered by this naval explorations, particularly in Latin America. So for me, it's a mix of all the visual, the literature behind, but it was, in my opinion, unintended at the beginning to be like a canonical type of literature. It just became as such because of the affordability of this means.
The audience.
Linda, I have a question for you. Could you talk about how these drawings functioned, the contract drawings, in cases of dispute, or talk about some instances of litigation which these arise, and I imagine some of that.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you for your question. So I found multiple instances, but they're still rare. So contract drawings are incredibly rare. It was really like, this is the work of years in the libraries and archives to piece them together. In terms of litigation, because I mean, there has been some work on contract drawings before, mostly for local, like with the focus on a city, for instance, or specific regions, on a specific workshop or specific artist. Yeah. What hasn't been so much discussed was how did these drawings, how were they used in case of litigation and lawsuits? So what I found was often that if they were used in such instances, they were detached from the original contract and then later filed with the lawsuit. So the contract drawing now survive in the litigation records and are detached from the lawsuit, from the notarial file. How were they used? So I showed this case from Puebla where the drawing, because it carried multiple signatures, was in fact, that's the only instance that I could find in the literature and in the archives. It's absolutely rare. It's so incredible that it was used to discover or dismantle like his forgery of a document, a written document that said, no, the artist got already paid. They did their work, they got paid, we are good. And they said, wait a minute, we didn't get paid. This document, I never signed this, is a forgery. Here's the original contract drawing with the original signatures. Judges, go ahead and compare them. And then the judges, in fact, ruled, yes, this written document is a forgery. And this, I mean, this is incredible that this, especially, but not surprising, because in the colonies, they had to deal with a lot of like corruption and mismanagement of money and funds. So they used this, I mean, as evidence in this case. It's absolutely fun. And this really speaks to the evidentiary nature of contract drawings. And in other cases, what else? Very often in case of litigation, contracts or commissions were renegotiated. So there was a completely new set of contract drawings commissioned doing the lawsuit itself, and the old ones were, okay, this commission is over, for instance, let's hire a new artist, and then a new drawing, because the jurists desired this proof, was demanded, drawn up, and then filed with the case. So there are many different instances, but I hope that in my forthcoming book, I show this entire aftermath after contract making, after the initial commission, how these documents were used later on, and very often also to the advantage of artists. So, and this is a really important point, they did not only serve the commissioners, they served the artists as well as securities.
What I don't know is whether the system, I know in Spain, where the painting happened usually, there was a system called della, where an artist would so the paper would be delivered on the basis of the contract, possibly for contract drawing, for most of them, as you say, that survive. But then two other artists would be called in to assess the painting. It happened in Italy too, and that was often where disputes started, because probably one was hired by one of the patrons who didn't like the work. And then there'd be a legal issue. But there were also things like people that didn't finish their painting, like Radon de Mejo, who was threatened with excommunication. And then a whole new contract had to be drawn up to say, if you don't finish this painting, but I'm not sure if there's a contract.
Yeah, I think these stories have been also really well discussed by art historians from different generations. But what is interesting to take these questions and ask them on a transregional and transcultural scale. And that's really the mission that I set out to do in the dissertation or in my book. But of course, I am just as everyone else in this room, we stand on the shoulders of giants. So great work has been done, and the task is to think this further.
And I think there's examples of the indigenous tribes are really interesting because, you know, then you think about who has the power here, you know,
and why we have left what we have left, right? How excluding, pardon me, this system was, of course.
You talked a little bit about the hierarchy between drawings as well, where commissioners would prefer a unique drawing over printed models. Were there prints made after contract drawings for artists to put in a portfolio or to kind of exhibit as an example of their prowess, or were there advancements in printmaking that maybe have them resemble drawings a little bit more closely with hand coloring, or I'm curious about this relationship between the two media.
This is a really important question. Thank you for asking this. But I don't want to occupy this Q&A. But it's, you know, the thing is, I want to make the case why drawings mattered in these transregional, cross-Atlantic, cross-Mediterranean, let's say, art commissions, because most often scholars focus on prints. But in reality, I mean, you cannot separate both media from each other, because many of the drawings recycle prints. They're based on prints, especially in architecture. Think about the Thurlian type that I discussed. And the other way around. I mean, prints also are based on drawings, right? So you cannot separate them from each other, although we do that and for very good reason in our scholarship. I think there is a point to be made why we do that. But in reality, it's the two media, works on paper, are interlinked, deeply interlinked, and it's hard to also, the final presentation of today showed this really well, how they are really closely intersected. The use of prints versus drawings in these legal spheres differentiate a bit within the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. So in the Atlantic, prints matter a lot more. Very often, and it's really difficult, you have these linguistic, or you have the verbal references to a specific image, and sometimes depending on whether it's in Latin, Italian, Spanish, these terms are so vague. For instance, if you think about exemplum in Latin, which are often used in the contract, or modello. Modello can be anything. Doesn't have, like, you don't know if this was a sculpture, so a three-dimensional object, if it was a print, if it was a drawing. So very often we don't know. So only in the cases where it's explicitly, where the term explicitly refers to drawing, we can say, well, yes, a drawing was used for a commission or a specific print, but very often it's very hard to differentiate, because the terms are like pinturas, it's very often used, can be both. We don't know. So you have to be really, you know, this is detective work to dissect these, to separate them. And I can also refer here to Aaron Hyman's great book, Rubens and Repeat, where he opens actually with a reference to a contract that says, you know, use this print for an altarpiece that was then produced. So prints matter much more in the Mediterranean, because it's such a, like, I mean, the Mediterranean is huge, but if you look at Italian customs and Spanish customs, this manuscript notarial culture was so strong that drawings, I mean, I haven't come across contracts where prints were one-on-one attached, because drawings were made by man or of the artist, and hence his name was also in the contract. So the visual and verbal went hand by hand, because it was executed in situ doing contract making. So this really mattered in the Mediterranean.
Any more questions? Okay.
think we should probably have a drink.
Well, thank you so much, Gonzalo, for joining. Oh, wait, I do. Oh, yes, no. Sorry, she's just saying thank you. Would you like to say some last things, Nicola?
Well, no, just thank you very much for coming on this side. Say it's been a really stimulating conversation. It's been a great day. I hope that all of our speakers today might be able to tune in tomorrow. It's be wonderful to carry on these conversations.
Yeah,
I think we'll have some interest. Technical difficulties.
Yeah.
We'll never say never. Oh, yeah. Exactly.
I think speakers to go downstairs to the library, just go take a couple of photos and so we all together. If everyone's comfortable with that, that's just
Everyone. Thank you, everyone online.
anybody that wants to
I'm not sure how much of you heard, but yes, hopefully tomorrow goes a little bit smoother. But we had some fantastic talks today, so thank you so much for joining. Thank you.